The night Delia Marsh turned 18, the state of Ohio gave her a garbage bag and a bus ticket. The garbage bag was black, the heavy-duty kind, and it held everything she owned: 3 shirts, 2 pairs of jeans, a hoodie with a broken zipper, a toiletry kit from the dollar store, a pair of socks with a hole in the left heel she'd been meaning to throw away for months, and a water-damaged photograph of a woman she barely remembered. The woman in the photograph was laughing at something off to the left of the camera, her head tilted back, her dark curly hair lifting slightly in some invisible wind. By the end of this story, I'm also going to share something special with those of you who stick around to the end, something that can help you in your personal life. But first, let's get back to... On the back, in handwriting that wasn't Delia's, someone had written simply, "Mama, 2007. Delia had been 4 years old in 2007. She kept the photograph not because it gave her comfort, but because it was evidence. Proof that she had come from somewhere, from someone, even if that someone had left her at a hospital intake desk in the middle of winter and never come back. The bus ticket was to Carlow, Ohio, a town she had never heard of, population 6,200, on a sign that had been there long enough to rust at the corners. Social worker who handed her both items was a tired woman named Joanna, who had processed 63 aging out cases
See how
in the
the wire
past
loops
fiscal
around the
year,
screw. Make sure it's
and
tight
who
against the
told
brass.
Delia,
Like this?
without
Yes,
meeting
exactly.
her eyes,
Now gently
that there
tighten
was
it.
a transitional
You got it,
housing
Mija.
program in Carlow with 2 available beds, and that Delia needed to present herself there within 72 hours, or the bed would go to someone else. Delia did not ask Joanna what would happen if she missed the 72 hours. She had been in the system long enough to know the answer to questions like that. Nothing would happen. There would simply be one fewer option, and the world would continue moving with the same indifferent momentum it had always had. She took the garbage bag and the bus ticket and walked out of the Cuyahoga County Children and Family Services building on a Thursday afternoon in late October with $47.11 in the pocket of her jeans. The sky was the color of old dishwater. Wind moved down the street in long, flat sheets, carrying fast food wrappers and the smell of exhaust. Delia stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking at the building she'd just left, and thought that if she had expected to feel something significant about this, about aging out, about the particular finality of the door closing behind her, she was going to be disappointed. She felt nothing except cold. The bus to Carlow left at 6 in the evening. She had 3 hours. She spent one of them sitting in a McDonald's on Euclid Avenue, nursing a coffee she'd bought with $1. 09, and working through the arithmetic of her situation the way she always had. Carefully, without sentimentality, the way her foster father Dale had taught her to approach a problem before she could allow herself to feel it. Dale had been her 4th placement and her best one. He was a retired electrician with knuckles like walnuts and a patience she had never been able to exhaust. He taught her to wire a light switch at age 9, to read a building schematic at 11, to assess structural damage by the feel of a floor underfoot at 12. Dale died of a stroke in the spring of her 13th year. Delia had cried in the bathroom with the fan running for 40 minutes, then come out and helped Dale's sister carry boxes, because there was nothing else useful she could do. $47. A bed that would last 72 hours and then become conditional on participation in a program she knew nothing about. A town she had never heard of. No phone. She'd had a prepaid that died 6 weeks ago, and she hadn't been able to replace it. No skills that translated obviously to anything an employer would recognize on paper, though she could assess load-bearing walls, rough in electrical, diagnose plumbing by sound, and read the bones of a building the way some people read faces. She drank the coffee. She thought through the arithmetic. She did not let herself think about anything that was not immediately useful. transitional housing program in Carlow was called New Horizons, and it occupied the third floor of a converted warehouse on the east side of town. It smelled like industrial cleaner, and something sweet underneath that Delia could not identify. There were 8 beds in her room, 4 of them occupied. The rules were laminated and posted on the wall above each bed. No drugs, no alcohol, no guests after 9, mandatory check-ins on Mondays and Thursdays, curfew at 10. Delia read them once and nodded at the intake coordinator, a young man named Trevian, with a kind face and the slightly worn expression of someone doing work he believed in, but that cost him something to do. She lasted 11 days. It was not any one thing. It was the cumulative weight of 8 beds in one room and a curfew that conflicted with the only reliable night shift work she'd found at a gas station 2 miles away, and a mandatory group session on Wednesday evenings that required her to talk about her feelings in front of strangers, which was something she was constitutionally unable to do. She left on a Tuesday before sunrise, taking her garbage bag and leaving the laminated rules exactly as she'd found them. Carlow in November was quiet and flat. Town sat in a shallow depression in the landscape, surrounded on 3 sides by farmland that had gone fallow, and on the 4th by a 2-lane highway that led to Hargrove, the nearest city of any real size, 22 miles west. Downtown was 2 blocks of storefronts, most of them occupied, some of them barely. A hardware store, a diner, a pharmacy, a bank, a laundromat that doubled as a cell phone accessories shop, a church with a sign out front that read "God loves you and so do we," which Delia passed 3 times a day and which she did not find comforting or the opposite of comforting, just present like everything else. She slept the first 2 nights in the laundromat, in the back corner behind the folding tables, after the owner locked up. She had noticed that the latch on the rear window sat loose in its frame and could be worked open from outside with patient pressure and a flat piece of metal, which she had in the form of a nail file from her toiletry kit. She was careful and quiet, and she replaced the window exactly as she'd found it both mornings, and she did not take anything or disturb anything. She told herself this mattered, the not disturbing, the replacing, that there was a difference between surviving and taking, and that she intended to stay on the correct side of that line. On the 3rd day, she found work. A woman named Bette Okafor, who owned a rental property on the north side of town, needed someone to replace the subflooring in the bathroom of an upstairs unit where a pipe had leaked for 2 months before anyone noticed. Delia saw the handwritten card on the hardware store's community board and presented herself at the address at 7 in the morning. It looked her up and down with the particular assessment of a woman who had been taken advantage of before and was not interested in being taken advantage of again. "How old are you?" Bette said. It was not quite a question. 18, Delia said. "You know subflooring." "I know all of it," Delia said. "Subflooring, framing, rough electrical, rough plumbing, tile, drywall. I can do the tile too if you want, once the floor is right." Bette looked at her for a long moment. "Cash," she said. $40 a day plus materials. Delia said yes. It took her 3 days. The subfloor was bad. OSB that had swelled and delaminated, the joist beneath it soft in 2 places where the water had sat long enough to do real damage. She sistered the joists with 2x8s she pulled from the back of Bette's truck, replaced the subfloor with 3/4 CDX, floated the tile over Hardybacker she cut by hand with a carbide scorer. When she was finished, Bette walked through the bathroom twice and then stood looking at the floor without saying anything. "You've done this before," Bette said. "Yes," said Delia. "Where?" Delia was quiet for a moment. "A man named Dale taught me. He was an electrician. He's dead now." He paid her $140 and then said, without preamble, "There's a pullout in the back office at my shop on Crane Street. You can sleep there if you need to while you're in town. Open at 7. I close at 6. I don't want to know anything I don't need to know, and I don't want any trouble." "Thank you," Delia said. She had been asleep in Bette's back office for 9 days when she first saw the carnival. She had known, in the way that people know things about a town after a few weeks of moving through it quietly, there was something on the far eastern edge of Carlow, a property set back from the road behind a stand of old oaks, gated, chain-link fence visible through the trees, and a handwritten sign that said Wyndham's Carnival and Spectacular. Private property, no trespassing, in letters that had once been red and were now the faded pink of something that had given up. She'd passed it twice on walks and hadn't thought about it, except to note it the way she noted everything, cataloging the town's geography out of habit, the way Dale had taught her to walk into a building and immediately identify the load-bearing walls and the exit points. She thought about it for the first time, really thought about it, on a night in mid-November when Bette's back office was occupied by Bette herself, who was working late on accounts, and Delia needed somewhere to be for 3 hours until the lights went off. She walked east on the road that ran along the fence line, her hands in the pockets of her hoodie, the night cold enough that her breath came in small clouds, and she looked through the chain link at the shapes in the darkness beyond. The shapes resolved slowly as her eyes adjusted. A ticket booth, its window boarded. Several trailers, some with their wheels flat, tilted at angles that suggested long abandonment. A ring of light poles, their bulbs dead. Behind all of it, large and strange against the sky, a building, circular, 2 stories, with a peaked roof and exterior panels painted in chevrons that might once have been red and white and were now the gray-brown of weathered wood. Had no windows. The entrance was a set of double doors, padlocked, with a wooden marquee above them from which individual letters had fallen, leaving a phrase that read, "Fun News World," and then a gap, and then a single letter D. It had been a funhouse, the kind with mirrors and spinning floors and trick corridors. She could tell by the marquee, by the circular footprint, by the way the roof peaked at the center. She could also tell, because she was someone who read buildings, that it was structurally sound. The walls were plumb. The roof had not sagged. Whatever had been done to this place when it was built, it had been built to last. She stood at the fence for a long time, longer than she meant to, looking at it. Then she walked back to the hardware store and sat on the steps in the cold and waited for Bette's light to go off. In the weeks that followed, the carnival occupied a corner of her mind the way difficult problems did, not urgently, but persistently, surfacing in quiet moments. She asked Bette about it once, casually, while she was pricing out caulk. "Wyndham's," Bette said, without particular inflection. "Been closed since I moved here. That was 19 years ago. Before that, far as I know, it operated seasonally. Summers, fall fair season. The Wyndhams ran it for 3 generations. Last one, old Clement Wyndham, died with no heirs anyone could find. Property went into probate limbo. County's been trying to untangle it for years." "Is it condemned?" Delia asked. Bette made a face that was not quite a shrug. "Nobody's declared it condemned, far as I know. Nobody's done anything with it. That's the problem. Nobody can until the estate is resolved." "The estate," Delia said. Bette looked at her over the caulk display. "Are you thinking about that property?" "No," Delia said. Bette said nothing, which was the most eloquent response available. The night she finally went in was not planned. It was the 3rd week of November, and the temperature had dropped to 22 degrees, and the pull-out in Bette's back office was not available because Bette's sister was visiting from Columbus and sleeping there. Delia had $40, which was enough for a motel room, but not enough for a motel room and everything else she needed for the rest of the week. She walked the town for 2 hours trying to work out whether the motel was worth it, and by the time she'd concluded it probably wasn't, she was standing in front of the chain link fence at the eastern edge of Carlow, looking at the dark shapes of the Carnival through the trees. Padlock on the gate was old, a master lock that had rusted in its shackle. She looked at it for a moment, then looked at the base of the fence post on the right side, where time and ground movement had worked the post loose from its concrete footer. She put her shoulder to it, and the post leaned enough to create a gap. She slipped through. The ground inside the fence was hard with frost, the dead grass crackling underfoot. She moved slowly, picking her way between the tilted trailers, her flashlight painting a narrow corridor through the dark. Trailers were empty when she shone the light through their cracked windows. Few held the remnants of what had been inside them: a collapsed folding table, a box of paper cups, coils of extension cord. Nothing of value, nothing disturbed in years. She came around the largest trailer, and the funhouse was there in front of her, 10 yards away across an open stretch of gravel. Up close, it was bigger than it had looked from the road. Exterior panels, she saw now, had been painted to resemble a jester's motley. Diamonds and chevrons in what would have been vivid color once, now muted to pastels by weather and time. Double doors were solid oak, reinforced at the corners with iron strapping that had gone brown with rust, padlocked with a heavy chain. But off to the left of the main doors, almost invisible in the shadows, there was a service entrance. A single door, narrower, with no chain, only a standard deadbolt. She crouched in front of it and ran her flashlight along the door frame. The frame was wood, and the wood had shrunk and shifted with years of freeze-thaw cycles, enough that there was visible daylight between the door edge and the strike plate. She pressed the door with the flat of her palm and felt it give slightly. The shrinkage had worked the bolt partially out of its throw. She reached into her bag for a thin strip of aluminum. She always kept one, cut from a paint can lid, because Dale had taught her that a properly chosen piece of thin metal was worth more than most tools, and slid it into the gap between the door and the frame, angling it down toward the bolt. 3 minutes of patient pressure, and the bolt retracted. The door swung inward, and the smell came out to meet her. Cool air, old wood, machine oil, and something else underneath that she couldn't name, a sweetness that was not quite decay and not quite preservation, something between the two. She stepped inside. The flashlight beam moved around the interior, and what she saw first was the mirrors. They were everywhere. Floor to ceiling on every wall, angled and segmented, some clear and some backed with colored film, so that they threw tinted light, amber, blue, red, back into the beam. Dozens of them, maybe more, covering every surface of the entry corridor. The beam multiplied and fractured until she was surrounded by 100 Delias in 100 different tints, each one looking back at her with the same careful expression. She moved deeper in. Corridor curved, the way funhouse corridors do, and opened into a larger room at the center of the building, the main floor, circular, maybe 40 feet across. Here the attractions were still in place. A barrel tunnel you were meant to walk through while it spun, now still. Tilted room with a false horizon. A hall of mirrors along the far wall, dozens of panels in shapes that distorted reflection, widening, narrowing, elongating, compressing. At the center of the room, mounted on a low platform, was a large mechanical fortune teller in a glass cabinet. A figure in gilded robes, seated behind a crystal ball, its painted face cracked along one cheek but otherwise intact, its one visible eye catching her beam and throwing it back. The floor was wood, old growth, tongue and groove, and when she walked across it, she could feel immediately that it was solid, not one soft spot. The roof overhead was intact, no visible water intrusion, no staining on the joists. She knocked on the nearest wall, and heard the density of old-growth framing behind the paneling. Not the hollow sound of decay, but the resonant thunk of wood that had been there long enough to become something close to stone. It was, structurally, one of the best buildings she had ever been in. She made a circuit of the main floor, then found the stairs at the back, narrow, utilitarian, not meant for visitors, meant for staff. They led to the second floor, which was a single large room that had apparently served as storage. It held equipment, mostly, coils of wire, spare light fixtures, crates of replacement mirror panels still wrapped in brown paper, a workbench along one wall with tools still laid out on it as if someone had stepped away mid-repair. There was a cot in one corner, a folding chair, a kerosene heater. The cot had a canvas cover, the chair had a thin cushion. Neither was clean, but neither was ruined. Delia stood in the middle of the storage room for a long moment. She set her bag down, pulled the canvas cover off the cot, and shook it outside the window, replaced it, sat down, and decided. She would stay here until something better materialized. Not forever, just until. She woke in the morning to gray light coming through the single window at the east end of the storage room and lay still for a moment, taking inventory. She was cold. She was not in danger. The building was dry and windtight, and the floor under the cot did not flex. She could hear, distantly, the sound of a crow somewhere outside. Everything was fine. She was not someone who paused long over fine. She got up, used the dollar store toiletry kit, and climbed down the staff stairs to the main floor. In daylight filtered through the gaps in the boarded windows, the Funhouse had a different quality. Quieter, the mirrors reflecting pale rectangles of light at each other rather than her flashlight beam. She walked the perimeter again, looking at it properly now, and what she noticed was the details. Someone had cared about this place. The framing was meticulous. She could see it where panels had come loose, where the underlying structure was exposed. The woodwork on the fortune teller's cabinet was hand-carved, intricate, the gilding on the robe's real leaf, even if it had faded. The mirror panels in the hall of mirrors were beveled, expensive even now, extraordinary for a traveling carnival of any era. This was not the prefabricated construction of something meant to be set up and torn down. This was meant to last. She thought about Clement Wyndham, the last one, the one who had died without heirs. She thought about the 3 generations who had preceded him, building a carnival that apparently had this at its center. A funhouse built like a cathedral, finished like a museum. She went back upstairs and started going through the storage room properly. Most of it was what it appeared to be: spare parts, maintenance supplies, the ordinary backstage inventory of a fairground attraction. In the far corner, behind the workbench, there was a cabinet she had not noticed the night before. It was built into the wall, floor to ceiling, with a simple wooden door. The door had a key lock. Key was in the lock. She opened it. Inside were shelves, and on the shelves were boxes. Not crates, not storage bins, but actual cardboard boxes, sealed with tape that had yellowed and dried to almost nothing, labeled in a tidy, cramped hand. The labels read things like Accounting 1987-1989, and Correspondence Misc and Land Records and Photographs, and Wyndham family documents, and one box on the middle shelf that was labeled simply Clement, Do Not Discard. She stood looking at the shelves for a long time. She took down the box labeled Clement, Do Not Discard, and set it on the workbench and stood looking at it for another long moment, her hands at her sides. This was not her property, technically. Nothing here was hers. She was a trespasser in an abandoned building, and whatever was in this box belonged to an estate that was currently in legal limbo. To heirs who had not yet been found or might never be found. To a county that didn't quite know what to do with any of it. She opened the box. Inside, at the top, was a sealed envelope with Clement's name on it in a different hand than the box labels. Older, more formal, the kind of penmanship that had been taught with a ruler. Below the envelope were papers, folded and rubber-banded in groups, and below those a leather journal, small, black-covered, worn smooth at the corners. She picked up the sealed envelope and turned it over. The return address was a law firm, Whitmore, Alcott & Keene, attorneys at law, Hargrove, Ohio. She set it down. She picked up the journal and opened it to the first page. The handwriting inside was not the formal penmanship of the envelope. It was something older, shakier, the hand of someone writing in age or illness. The ink had faded to a rust color at the margins, but was still readable in the middle of each line. The date at the top of the first entry was September 14th, 2003. She read, "My name is Harlan Wyndham. I am 71 years old and I am dying, and there is something I need to write down before I can't anymore. Mice Clement is 38. Is a good man who loves this carnival the way I love it, the way my father loved it before me, but he is not a businessman. He does not understand what this ground holds. He thinks this place is worth what it earns in a summer season, which is not much anymore. He is wrong." She read for a long time. Harlan Wyndham had been, it emerged over the first dozen pages, something considerably more complicated than a carnival operator. He had inherited the Wyndham property from his own father, who had purchased it in 1931, for reasons that were apparently not entirely related to the carnival business. The land, 120 acres, of which the carnival occupied perhaps 8, sat over a geological formation that Harlan's father had recognized, through conversation with a friend who worked in mineral extraction, as potentially significant. He had never acted on this knowledge, had kept the carnival running, had never sold. Son Harlan had held the same knowledge, tighter, had never breathed a word of it to anyone, had watched developers and land agents come and go over the decades, and had told them all the same thing: not for sale, not interested, go away. Because Harlan Wyndham knew something about the land beneath his carnival that he had never told another living person. Delia was reading quickly now, her flashlight steady on the pages, her breath slightly elevated. She reached the entry dated October 3rd, 2003. I had the property formally assessed 5 years ago, 1998. I used a firm from Columbus, people with no local connections, people who owed me nothing and to whom I was nobody. Paid cash. I told Clement it was an insurance assessment. The report is in the cabinet in the storage room, in the box with the land records. I have never looked at the full report since the day it arrived, because the number on the front page was so large that it frightened me. I am not a man who frightens easily. The number frightened me because of what it would do, what it would bring, people it would bring. She paused, looked at the shelf, found the box labeled Land Records, pulled it down, opened it. Inside were papers, documents, rubber-banded and folded. She worked through them. Deeds, survey maps, old property tax records, a letter from a county assessor dated 1974. Near the bottom of the box was a bound report. Spiral bound with a cardboard cover, the cover stamped with the name of an engineering and geology firm she did not recognize. Callaway Geosciences, Columbus, Ohio. The date on the cover was March 1998. She opened it. The executive summary was on the second page, and it was written in the deliberately temperate language of professional reports. But even through the professional temperament, what it said was clear. The Wyndham property in Carlow, Ohio, comprising approximately 120 acres, contained within its subsurface geology a deposit of natural gas and associated condensate liquids of substantial volume, located at depth in a formation consistent with similar producing formations in the Utica and Marcellus shale trends to the east and south. Before we find out what happened next in the story, I want to take a brief moment to speak directly to anyone watching who might be going through their own sudden, overwhelming transition. If you are navigating a bitter divorce, the loss of a spouse, or a financial shock, you know the hardest part isn't just the money, it's not knowing what to do first. That is exactly why we created the Phoenix Blueprint. It is a practical, step-by-step guide for starting over. It doesn't have fluffy affirmations or vision boards. It is a tactical survival manual. It gives you the exact checklist for the first 48 hours, including the one rule you must follow. Do not make any decision you cannot reverse. It includes the Found Money worksheet, showing you exactly how to check state databases, because 1 in 7 Americans actually has unclaimed money waiting for them right now. It even gives you word-for-word boundary scripts to use when family members pressure you for money or try to make decisions for you. You can get the entire guide right now for just $17. If you're watching on your TV, just pull out your phone, open your camera, and scan the QR code on the screen right now. If you're on a computer or phone, click the top link in the description. You don't have to figure this out alone. Now, let's get back to the story. Preliminary estimates of recoverable resource were followed by a number that made Delia's hand tighten on the page. The number was not the number Harlan had mentioned being frightened by. This was a 1998 preliminary estimate, qualified by uncertainties and ranges. Even the low end of the range, the most conservative figure on the page, was more money than Delia had any frame of reference for. Not in the way that most large numbers were abstract to her. She had grown up understanding abstractly that some people had enormous wealth. This was different. This was a number attached to a specific piece of ground that she was standing on, in a building that she had entered through a door with a broken bolt, in a town where she had arrived 3 weeks ago with $47 in her pocket. She sat down on the workbench stool and held the report in both hands and looked at the number for a long time. She went back to the journal. The later entries were increasingly urgent, increasingly anxious. Harlan wrote about a man named Gerald Fitch, a developer from Hargrove who had been trying for years to acquire the Wyndham property, and who had recently begun, Harlan suspected, to investigate its mineral potential. He wrote about his fear for Clement, who he described repeatedly as too trusting, too open, too willing to believe in people's good intentions. He wrote about a conversation he'd had with a lawyer in Hargrove, a conversation that had gone badly because the lawyer had connections Harlan didn't fully understand, and which he had since come to suspect were connections to Gerald Fitch. He wrote, in the last few entries, about a plan. The plan was methodical and careful, the plan of a man who had grown up watching other people lose things, and who had decided that if he was going to die, he was going to make it as difficult as possible for anyone to take what was his family's. He had transferred the mineral rights, which in Ohio are separable from surface rights and can be deeded independently, into a separate document. He had placed that document, along with a supplementary legal filing asserting the Wyndham family's claim to those rights in perpetuity, regardless of what happened to the surface property, inside a sealed container that he had then concealed within the structure of the funhouse itself. I am an old Carnival man, Harlan wrote, and I know that people looking for valuables look in the obvious places. Look in boxes and safes and filing cabinets. They do not look inside walls. They do not look inside the architecture of a funhouse, because a funhouse is by its nature full of false surfaces and hidden mechanisms, and they assume they already know what is behind the illusion. Do not understand that sometimes the most important thing is the thing that the illusion is built around. Delia put the journal down slowly. She stood up and looked at the room around her. The walls, the floor, the built-in cabinet, And then she looked at the stairs leading down to the main floor, and she thought about the funhouse in the particular way that Dale had taught her to look at buildings. Not at their surfaces, but at their structure. Not at what they showed, but at what they were made of. She thought about the fortune teller in the glass cabinet at the center of the room below. She thought about what Harlan had written. The most important thing is the thing that the illusion is built around. She took her flashlight and went downstairs. The fortune teller's cabinet was maybe 4 feet wide, 3 feet deep, 5 feet tall, mounted on a platform 6 inches above the floor. Figure inside, seated, robed, its painted face cracked at the cheek, had both hands extended over the crystal ball in a gesture of revelation. The crystal ball was a glass sphere, slightly larger than a basketball, sitting on a turned wooden pedestal inside the cabinet. Delia walked around the cabinet slowly. She knocked on the sides, solid, panel construction, hardwood, no hollow space behind them. She knocked on the platform, hollow. As you'd expect from a platform built over a mechanical housing, the kind of thing that had once powered the cabinet's movements when coins were inserted. She got down on her knees and looked at the underside of the platform. The platform was enclosed on 3 sides. On the 4th side, the side facing away from the main entrance and toward the staff corridor at the back of the room, there was a panel. It was fitted with the same tongue and groove precision as the rest of the platform, painted to match, invisible unless you were looking directly at it from below at close range. One corner of the panel, barely visible, was a small brass fitting, the kind that accepted a hex key. She went back upstairs and went through the tools on the workbench until she found a set of hex keys, old and slightly rusty, hanging on a nail. She came back down, lay flat on the floor, selected the fitting size, and turned it. Panel released with a soft mechanical click, swinging down on internal hinges, and behind it was a space, maybe 18 inches deep, 12 inches wide, lined with cedar and dry as a bone. Inside the space was a metal box, the kind with a combination lock, and beside the metal box was a second sealed envelope. The envelope was addressed in Harlan's cramped, aging handwriting. It was addressed to Clement Wyndham. Below the name, in smaller letters, it said, "Or to whoever finds this, with God's help, at the right time." Delia lay on the cold floor of the funhouse and looked at the envelope in the beam of her flashlight and felt, for the first time in a very long time, something that was not a part of her survival arithmetic. She felt the particular weight of being in the presence of something that had been waiting, something that had been hidden not out of fear alone, but out of faith. Harlan's faith that eventually, one way or another, the right moment would come. She did not open the envelope, not yet. She was 18 years old. She had no legal standing to any of this. She was a trespasser in an abandoned building in a town she had arrived in 3 weeks ago with $47. She needed to think before she touched anything else. She replaced the panel, turned the hex key, and lay flat on the cold floor for a moment longer, staring up at the fortune teller's cracked, painted face through the glass, the one visible eye catching the flashlight beam. Then she got up and went back upstairs and sat on the workbench stool and opened the journal again and read it from the beginning. She read it all the way through, twice, carefully this time, noting details, cross-referencing what she found against the documents in the land records box. Took most of the day. By the time she finished, the light through the storage room's single window had shifted from gray morning to the orange of late afternoon, and she had a much clearer picture of what she was dealing with. Harlan Wyndham had died in November 2003, 6 weeks after his final journal entry, according to the death notice she found clipped to the back cover. Clement Wyndham had inherited the property and had continued operating the carnival on a limited schedule for another 4 years, until a combination of debt and declining attendance had made it impossible to sustain. Closed the carnival in 2007, the same year the woman in Delia's photograph had left her at a hospital intake desk, which was the kind of coincidence that meant nothing except that the world moved along its own schedule regardless of what happened to you. Clement had died in 2019 after a series of strokes. He had no children, no surviving siblings. The estate, which at time of death appeared to consist primarily of the Carlow property, had entered probate. Probate had stalled because the mineral rights, which had been separately deeded, as Harlan had noted in the journal, were not properly recorded in the county land records, having apparently been filed with a title company that had since been acquired again, and dissolved, its records scattered across 3 different successor entities. Without a clear mineral rights chain of title, the estate value was impossible to assess accurately, and without accurate estate value, probate could not be completed, and without probate, the property could not be sold, transferred, or developed. This was what Bette had called probate limbo. This was the thing that had kept the carnival property frozen for 5 years, the thing that had vented the county from moving on it, the thing that had kept Gerald Fitch, whom Delia found referenced in 2 of the correspondence boxes, in letters that her increasingly uneasy about him, from getting what he apparently wanted. Gerald Fitch was a developer from Hargrove. He had tried to purchase the Wyndham property from Clement in 2015, 2016, and twice in 2017, according to the correspondence. Clement had refused each time. After Clement's death, Fitch had been appointed. Through a motion she found in the correspondence that appeared to have been handled by a lawyer she did not recognize, as a provisional administrator of the estate during the probate process, a position that gave him oversight of the property without giving him ownership, which he appeared to have used primarily to block any resolution that might have given someone else a claim. The most recent letter in the correspondence box was dated 8 months ago, was from the county probate court, addressed to the office of Gerald Fitch as provisional estate administrator. Informed him that the court had received an inquiry from a genealogy research firm regarding potential Wyndham heirs, and that the court intended to pursue this inquiry. Fitch's response, handwritten in the margin of his copy and apparently misfiled in the Wyndham documents rather than his own: delay as long as possible. All options. Delia read those 5 words 3 times. She was not a person who frightened easily. Dale had taught her that fear was information, not instruction, and the appropriate response to information was to assess it and decide, not to let it drive. She assessed this. Gerald Fitch was a man with significant local influence, legal tools she did not fully understand, and an apparent willingness to use both to prevent the Wyndham estate from being properly resolved. He did not know about the documents in the Funhouse. If he had, he would have found them, or had the building demolished. He did not know about the mineral rights assessment, or he would have moved faster. He was playing a long, slow game of obstruction, and he had been winning it for 5 years. She was 18 years old with $43. She thought about Dale, who had looked at a crumbling house on a flooded lot and told her the bones were good and you could do a lot with good bones. She thought about the bones of the funhouse around her, solid and dry and built to last. She thought about what Harlan had written. Sometimes the most important thing is the thing that the illusion is built around. She was not the heir to this property. She had no claim to any of this. But she was the person who was here, who had found what Harlan had hidden, who had read the journal and understood the trap that was closing around an estate that no one was properly protecting. She made a decision. Not about the property. She was clear-eyed about her standing, which was effectively none. About the information, about the documents, about the sealed envelope and the locked metal box under the fortune teller's platform. Someone needed to know. Someone needed to be told before Gerald Fitch found another way to advance his position, before whatever genealogy inquiry was happening, resolved into something he could interfere with. She needed a lawyer, not a lawyer with local connections, not a lawyer who owed Gerald Fitch anything, a lawyer who was, in Harlan's phrase, someone with no local connections, someone who was nobody to the people involved. She had $43 and no phone. He climbed down the staff stairs, worked the service door open from the inside, crossed the frost-hard ground to the gap in the fence, and went to find a public library. The Carlow Public Library was on the main block between the pharmacy and the church, open until 8 on Tuesdays. The librarian was a man named Harold, who was approximately 70 years old, and who pointed Delia at the public access computers without asking her anything. She sat down, opened a browser, and started to work. She spent 2 hours reading about Ohio probate law, about mineral rights, about estate administration, about provisional administrators and their limits of authority. She read the county court dockets and found the Wyndham estate case, which was a public record, and read through the filings, which confirmed everything she had found in the correspondence box and added details she hadn't had. The genealogy inquiry was from a firm called Heritage Connections out of Dayton, apparently hired by the court itself to resolve the heir question. There had been a Wyndham daughter, Clement's sister, whom Delia had found no mention of in the journal, who had apparently left Carlow in 1988, long before Clement's death. Her name was Margaret Wyndham, and the Heritage Connections report, which was included in the court record as a sealed exhibit, had apparently located a living descendant whose name was redacted in the public version of the filing. There was a living heir. There was a living heir who apparently did not know the full picture of what they stood to inherit, because the full picture was locked in a cedar-lined compartment under a mechanical fortune teller in an abandoned funhouse in a town the heir had apparently not visited. Gerald Fitch, who had been appointed to administer the estate, had written in the margin of a court letter, "Delay as long as possible, all options." Delia looked at the screen for a long moment. Then she searched for independent estate attorneys in the Dayton and Columbus area with no apparent connection to Hargrove, Ohio. She found 3 that looked promising. She wrote down their addresses and phone numbers on a piece of paper Harold gave her. She returned the paper to her pocket, nodded her thanks to Harold, and walked back out into the cold. She stood on the sidewalk in front of the library in the dark, her hands in her pockets, and thought. She had no phone. She had $43. She had, in the funhouse on the eastern edge of this town, a journal, a mineral rights assessment report, a land records archive, and a sealed compartment containing documents that might be the most important piece of the entire picture. She also had a decision to make. The correct decision was to contact the court or the genealogy firm directly, to tell someone in official authority what she had found, to place herself into the hands of a process that might or might not take her seriously, that might or might not move at the speed the situation required. But she thought about Gerald Fitch's handwriting in the margin. All options. She was going to need more than a phone call. She was going to need to understand exactly what was in that locked box before she handed it to anyone, because once she handed it to someone, she had no further ability to ensure it reached the right person. She needed to open the box. She walked back to the Carnival, The combination lock on the metal box was a 3-dial, the kind that opened to a preset combination set by the manufacturer unless changed. She had learned from Dale, who had learned it from a locksmith he'd hired once to open a padlock he'd lost the key to, that most combination locks of this type sold before 1990 had a small number of default factory combinations that were never changed by casual users. He worked through them systematically. 000, then 999, then the 2 most common factory presets for the brand she could make out on the lock body, and on the 4th attempt, the shackle clicked open. Inside the box was a legal document, folded in thirds. It was typed, formal, 2 pages, with signatures at the bottom and a notary stamp that had faded but was still legible. It was a deed conveying the mineral rights to the Wyndham property, all 120 acres, all depths, all recoverable resources, to the Wyndham Family Trust, a specific provision that those rights could not be severed from the family line, could not be sold or transferred to any party outside direct Wyndham descent without unanimous consent of all living heirs, and would pass automatically and perpetually to Wyndham heirs, regardless of what happened to the surface property. The notary stamp was dated February 28, 2003, 8 months before Harlan's first journal entry. He had moved deliberately, quietly, before writing a word about any of it. Beside the deed was a second document, handwritten this time, 3 pages in Harlan's cramped rust-colored ink. It was a letter addressed to Clement, and it said in full everything the journal had circled around: the mineral assessment, the estimate, the specific formation, the name of the geology firm, the precautions Harlan had taken, and a number. The number was the one Harlan had said frightened him. Delia read it twice. Then she sat on the cold concrete floor of the funhouse with the documents in her lap and allowed herself, for exactly as long as it took to take 2 slow breaths, to feel the full weight of what she was holding. Then she folded the documents carefully, replaced them in the box, closed the box without engaging the lock, replaced the panel, and stood up. She had work to do. She spent the next day and a half doing it carefully. She photographed every document in the storage room with the disposable camera she'd bought at the pharmacy for $11, land records, correspondence, the Callaway Geosciences report, Harlan's journal, page by page. She made notes in her own hand, a clean timeline, cross-referencing dates and names. She found in the Wyndham family documents box a photograph of Clement and a woman she did not recognize, a younger woman standing in front of the funhouse entrance. On the back, in Clement's hand, "Me and Peggy, summer 1985, Margaret, Peggy." She filed that away. She had the journal, the photographs, the notes. She had the documents. She had a name, Gerald Fitch, Provisional Administrator, Hargrove, Ohio. She had 3 names of attorneys with no local connections. What she did not have was any idea what to do with all of it. She sat on the workbench stool on the evening of the second day and looked at the storage room around her. The shelves of boxes, the tools on the workbench, the cot in the corner, and tried to think clearly about her position. She was a trespasser with no phone and $42 who had stumbled on something that could change an unknown person's life. Someone who didn't even know the extent of what they had coming to them. Someone, the provisional administrator of their family's estate, was actively working to delay reaching. She thought about what she had known and not known about her own situation over the years. About the garbage bag and the bus ticket. About the way systems worked when they were not working for you. About the way powerful men used paperwork, the way other people used weather. She thought about Dale, who had looked at a condemned building and said, "Somebody should have stood up for this sooner." She stood up, put on her hoodie, checked that the disposable camera was in her bag, and went to Bette's hardware store to use the telephone. Bette was behind the counter inventorying paint when Delia came in. She looked at Delia with the expression she always wore, not quite neutral, but professional in its restraint. She did not ask about the carnival. She had not asked since the one time Delia had not confirmed she was thinking about it. "Can I use your phone?" Delia said. "It's important." Bette set down the paint can and pushed the handset across the counter. Delia dialed the first number on her list. The call went to voicemail. She dialed the second. A receptionist answered, and after a brief exchange, transferred her. Attorney's name was Petra Vasquez. She was in Columbus, and she had never heard of Carlow, Ohio, or Gerald Fitch, or the Wyndham estate. She said, when Delia had given her the 3-sentence version, "Tell me from the beginning," so Delia did. Standing at Bette's counter, with Bette pretending to inventory paint and the afternoon light coming gray through the hardware store window, Delia told her from the beginning. Carnival, the storage room, the journal, the report, the documents, Fitch's margin note. When she finished, Petra Vasquez was quiet for a moment. "How old are you?" she said. 18. "You're living in this building." "At the moment, yes." Another silence. Then, "You understand you have no legal claim to any of this." "I know that." "You understand what you've found is significant, but that acting on it is not straightforward." "I know that too." "Miss Marsh," Petra said, "I want you to not touch anything else in that building until I can make some calls." "Can you do that?" "Yes." "And I'd like to speak to you again tomorrow morning." "Can you call me from the same number?" Delia looked at Bette, who was still not looking up from the paint. "I think so," she said. "Good," said Petra Vasquez. "Don't talk to anyone else about this. Don't approach the court directly. Don't contact the genealogy firm. And most importantly, don't let on to anyone in that town what you've found." "Why not?" "Because if Gerald Fitch has the kind of reach you're describing, he has ears in places that people in small towns always underestimate. And because what you've found is a map to something worth a great deal of money, and maps attract the wrong kind of attention when word gets out before the right people are in position." "What kind of position?" Delia said. "The kind that protects the heir," Petra said, "when we find them." Delia set the phone back on the counter. Bette was still not looking at her. "Thank you," Delia said. Said Bette. Delia walked back out into the gray November afternoon, her bag on her shoulder, the disposable camera inside it, $42 in her pocket. She walked the 2 miles back to the eastern edge of town and the chain-link fence and the gap where the post had been worked loose from its footer, and she went inside. She climbed the staff stairs to the storage room and sat on the cot with the journal in her lap, open to the last entry. Harlan's final words, rust-colored on yellowed paper. "I have done what I can do. The rest is up to whoever comes next. I believe in this. Not because I am a religious man, though I am that too, but because I have spent my life running a show where ordinary people walk into a room full of mirrors and what they see surprises them. What they see is more versions of themselves than they knew existed. I have always thought there was something in that worth keeping. The surprise of yourself, the discovery that the world is larger on the inside than it looks from outside. Whoever you are when you find this, the carnival is yours. Not legally, not yet, but in spirit, in intention, in the belief of an old man who loved it and tried to protect it. Use it well." Delia closed the journal carefully, set it on the shelf, and lay down on the cot with her hands behind her head, staring at the ceiling in the failing light. Outside, in the distance, she could hear a crow calling, and the faint sound of the wind moving through the bare oaks that lined the eastern edge of the property, and the particular silence of a town that had no idea what was turning, slowly, underneath the surface of its ordinary evening. She was not the heir, but she was the one who was here. She was, she thought, beginning to understand the difference between those two things, and also beginning to understand how, in the right circumstances, they might amount to the same thing. She closed her eyes and listened to the building settle around her and waited for morning. Petra Vasquez called back the next morning at 9, and the first thing she said was, "I found the heir." Delia was standing at Bette's counter again, the handset pressed to her ear. Bette doing something with a receipt printer that made a rhythmic tearing sound in the background. "That was fast," Delia said. "The genealogy report was already in the court record. I just needed access to the sealed portion, which required a formal information request that a probate attorney of record can make." Petra's voice was measured, the voice of someone who had been doing difficult things for a long time, and no longer needed to perform composure. "The heir is a woman named Rosalie Fenn. She was born Rosalie Margaret Wyndham Alcott in 1989 in Columbus, 34 years old. Her mother was Margaret Wyndham, Clement's younger sister, who left Carlow in 1988, changed her name after a marriage, and died in 2017. Rosalie has been told she may be an heir to a modest estate in rural Ohio. That is the extent of what she knows." "Modest," Delia said. "That is what the court communication said, which tracks with what you're telling me. If the mineral rights are missing from the estate record, if the Callaway assessment has never been filed, then from the court's perspective, this is an abandoned Carnival property with significant back taxes and unclear value. So she doesn't know, she has no idea. She told the genealogy firm she wasn't sure she was interested in pursuing a claim. She said, and I have the transcript, that she didn't have money for legal fees on a property that might be worth less than it costs to probate." Delia held the phone and said nothing for a moment. Now, outside the hardware store window, a pickup truck went by, slow, the way trucks went by in small towns where there was no particular reason to hurry. "Fitch involved in managing her communication with the court," Delia said. "He's the provisional administrator, so technically yes. All correspondence regarding the estate passes through his office or with his knowledge, which means he knows about Rosalie Fenn. He's known for months, and she's still undecided about pursuing the claim, which tells you something about how the situation has been managed," Petra said. She paused. "Miss Marsh, I need to ask you something directly. Go ahead. Why are you doing this? You have nothing to gain from any of it. You're not the heir. You found something, and the reasonable thing for someone in your position to do would be to walk away and not get involved." Delia thought about Harlan's final journal entry. "Whoever you are, when you find this, faith of a dying man in whoever came next." "Not sure I believe in walking away from things that need doing," she said. Didn't feel like enough of an answer, but it was the honest one. Petra was quiet for a moment. "All right, here is what I need from you. I need those documents photographed thoroughly, every page of the journal, every page of the assessment report, the deed, the letter to Clement. I need the photographs developed and the original secured. I need you to not, under any circumstances, remove those documents from that property, because the moment they leave the property, their chain of custody becomes complicated in ways that could be exploited. I need you to hold on for 72 hours while I drive to Dayton and speak to Rosalie Fenn in person. You're going to tell her everything. I'm going to tell her enough. The rest she'll need to see for herself." "Will she come?" Delia said. "I don't know yet. But if she's anything like her grandfather sounds, she'll come." Delia spent the 72 hours the way she always spent uncertain time, working. Bette had 2 more jobs, a window replacement on a Victorian on the north side and a bathroom tile repair in a rental unit on the west end of town. And Delia worked both of them cleanly, her hands doing what they knew while her mind turned the situation over and over in the way that problems needed turning before they yielded anything useful. She thought about Rosalie Fenn in Columbus, being told by a lawyer she'd never met that she needed to come to a small town she'd never visited to look at documents hidden in an abandoned funhouse. She thought about what it would feel like to receive that call from your ordinary life. Whatever ordinary life Rosalie had, whatever she woke up to in the mornings, whatever she was holding when the phone rang, she thought about being handed a thing you didn't know you were waiting for. She thought about Dale, about the day he'd shown her a house that had been condemned and walked her through it room by room, pointing out what was wrong and what was right, and at the end had said, "Somebody built this with intention. You can feel it in the bones." Somebody thought this would last. She had been 11 years old, and she had not entirely understood what he meant, but she had felt it, the weight of someone else's care, laid into the walls of a building decades before, waiting to be recognized. She felt that now, in the funhouse, in Harlan's cramped rust-colored words. On the morning of the third day, she was replacing grout in the Victorian bathroom when her name was called from the doorway. She turned to find Bette standing there with a look that was not quite her usual professional restraint. "There's someone at the store," Bette said, "asking for you. Drove up from Columbus." Delia set down the grout float. Rosalie Fenn was sitting on the stool behind the hardware store counter when Delia came in. Not the customer side of the counters, which was where most people would have sat, but the employee side, as if she had assessed the geography of the room and chosen the position that made most sense. She was 34, slight, with dark curly hair pulled back from her face, and an expression of studied composure that Delia recognized immediately because it was the same expression she wore herself. The look of someone who had learned to assess before committing to anything, including a feeling. She was wearing good boots and a coat that had seen real winters, and she had a bag over one shoulder that was practical rather than fashionable. She looked at Delia the way Delia had looked at the funhouse from across the frozen gravel on that first night, taking in the structure, looking for what it was built on. "You're Delia Marsh," Rosalie said. "Yes. You're 18. Yes. The attorney told me you've been living in the funhouse." "Not living, staying." Rosalie looked at her steadily. "For how long?" "About 3 weeks." "You found my grandfather's things in that time." "Your great-grandfather's." "Harlan." "Your grandfather was Clement. Your mother was Margaret Clement's younger sister." Something moved briefly across Rosalie's face. Not surprise at the information, which Petra would have given her, but something else. The name, maybe. Margaret. Her mother. "She died in 2017, Rosalie said. "It wasn't a question. I know. I'm sorry." "Do you know her?" "No. I found her name in your great-grandfather's documents." A photograph of her and Clement in front of the funhouse. 1985 it was labeled. She would have been, Delia did the math, about 15 or 16. Rosalie was quiet for a moment. "She and my mother were not close at the end. My mother left this town when she was 18 and never came back and never talked about why. I knew there was family here, but it wasn't something she discussed. When the genealogy people contacted me, I almost didn't respond." "Why did you?" Rosalie looked at the counter, at her hands. "Because my mother left me a letter when she died. Didn't understand it fully until the genealogy people called. She said there was something in Carlow that should have been ours. She said she'd been afraid to go back, and she was sorry she hadn't tried harder. She asked me to go if I ever had a reason to." "Petra gave you a reason," Delia said. "Petra told me enough to be curious. She didn't tell me the number. She said I needed to see it in person." Rosalie looked up. "Is she right?" "Yes," Delia said. "She is." Walked to the Carnival together, the two of them side by side on the road that ran along the fence line, the bare oaks moving overhead in a cold wind. Rosalie looked at the property through the chain link without saying anything. "This has been closed since you were born," Delia said. "I know. I looked it up on the drive down." Rosalie studied the shapes beyond the fence. "My grandfather, Clement. He operated it for a few years after my great-grandfather died, and then he couldn't keep it going. The debt caught up with him." She paused. "Or that's what the court papers said. Is that what you found?" "There was debt, yes. But the correspondence suggests most of it was managed, that the property was never actually in the kind of distress that would have forced a sale. Kept Clement from selling or developing or extracting value from this land was the same thing that kept your great-grandfather from doing it." "Which was?" "The knowledge of what was underneath it," Delia said, "and the fear of what that knowledge would attract." She worked the fence post loose, and they went through the gap, and Delia led Rosalie across the frost-hard ground to the service entrance. The door swung inward, and the smell came out again, cool air and old wood and machine oil, and that sweet undercurrent she still couldn't name, and Rosalie stopped in the doorway and breathed it in. "Never been here," Rosalie said quietly. "I've never seen this place before." She stepped inside. They went through the corridor of mirrors and into the main floor, and Rosalie stopped again, looking at the fractured reflections, the still barrel tunnel, the tilted room, the hall of mirrors. She walked to the fortune teller's cabinet and stood in front of it, looking at the cracked painted face, the hands extended over the crystal ball. "He built this," Rosalie said. "My great-grandfather. His father built it. Harlan expanded it. He built the Funhouse himself, starting in 1961. That's in the journal. He said his father's Carnival was good, but that it needed something permanent at its center, something that would outlast the trailers and the tents." She paused. "He was right about the construction. I've been through every inch of this building. It's one of the soundest structures I've ever been in." Rosalie looked at her. "You're a contractor?" "I know buildings. Someone taught me." Rosalie nodded slowly, the way people nod when an explanation is incomplete but sufficient for the moment. She walked the perimeter of the main floor, touching the wall panels, testing the floor with her weight, tilting her head to look at the ceiling joists. She was not performing inspection. She was simply presence in the space, absorbing it, the way you absorb a place that belongs to you before you know it belongs to you. Went upstairs. Delia showed her the storage room, the shelves of boxes, the built-in cabinet standing open. Rosalie looked at the boxes for a long time without touching them. "My great-grandfather organized all of this. Before he died, yes. He spent his last months getting it in order, because he was afraid someone would come for it after he was gone." "Gerald Fitch," Rosalie said. "Petra told me the name." "What does he want exactly? He wants the property, but what he's wanted for years is what's under it. What he doesn't know is that the mineral rights are separately deeded and non-transferable outside the Wyndham family line." Delia picked up the land records box and set it on the workbench. "Your great-grandfather made it so that even if the surface property changed hands, the resource beneath it stays with your family. Or it's supposed to. The deed is what's in the compartment under the fortune teller." Rosalie turned to look at her. "You found the compartment. Your great-grandfather's journal described it. He wanted whoever found it to find it. You open it." "Yes. I needed to know what we were dealing with before I contacted anyone." Delia met Rosalie's gaze. "I didn't take anything and I didn't damage anything. The documents are exactly as he left them." Rosalie was quiet for a moment, then, "Show me." They went back down to the main floor, and Delia got down on the floor beside the fortune teller's platform, found the hex fitting, turned it, and the panel released. She reached into the cedar-lined space and brought out the metal box, set it on the platform edge, entered the combination, and opened it. Rosalie took out the folded deed with both hands and opened it carefully, reading. Delia watched her read. Her face was still concentrated. When she reached the signature and the notary stamp, she traced it with one finger without pressing, as if the ink might be wet still. Then she took out the letter. Harlan's handwriting, 3 pages, rust-colored and cramped. She read slowly. When she finished, she folded the letter back along its creases and set it in the box and did not say anything for a long time. Delia stayed quiet. There was nothing to say that the documents had not already said. "What's the number?" Rosalie said finally. "The one in the letter," Delia told her. Rosalie turned and walked to the hall of mirrors and stood in front of a panel that widened her reflection into something twice as broad as her actual frame. She stood looking at herself like that for a moment. "That's in 2003 money," Delia said. "Natural gas prices have moved considerably since then. The Utica and Marcellus formations have both been developed more extensively. Current assessment would almost certainly be higher." "How much higher?" "I don't know. Petra would have a better sense of how to get it assessed." Rosalie nodded, still looking at her widened reflection. Then she turned around. "How did you get here?" "To Carlow. To this building." Delia gave her the short version. "Bus ticket. The transitional housing. Bette's back office. The night she'd walked the fence line because she needed somewhere to be for 3 hours. You were sleeping in here when you found this." "Yes, and you had no idea what it was." "No, I knew the building was sound. I knew someone had cared about it. The rest I found." Rosalie looked at her for a long time. "You could have walked away when you realized what it was." "I could have, but you didn't." "No, why not?" Delia thought about it. "Because somebody built this with intention," she said. "And somebody spent their last months hiding what they'd built to protect it for whoever came next. I was whoever came next." She paused. "I didn't think I had the right to walk away from that." Rosalie was quiet. Then she turned back to the hall of mirrors and looked at the row of panels. The widening one, the narrowing one, the one that stretched her out, tall and elongated, the one that compressed her into something short and round, the one at the end that reflected her exactly as she was, unchanged. She looked at that last one for a moment. Then she picked up Harlan's letter and read it again, standing there in the hall of mirrors with her reflection watching her. "My mother should have been the one to find this," Rosalie said. She said it quietly, to the mirror as much as to Delia. "But she wasn't." "No." Rosalie folded the letter again. "She wasn't." She paused. "Can I take the journal upstairs and read it?" "It's your journal," Delia said. Rosalie picked up the metal box with the documents and carried it upstairs, and Delia heard the stool scrape on the floor above, and then silence, and she sat on the main floor with her back against the fortune-teller's platform and listened to Rosalie read. She was up there for 2 hours. Delia sat and let her be. When Rosalie came back down, she had the journal in one hand and an expression that was different from the composed one she'd arrived with. Not undone. She was not someone who came undone easily. Delia had already understood that about her, but different. As if something that had been held tight for a long time had been carefully, deliberately released. "He wrote about my mother," Rosalie said, in the later entries. "He knew she'd left, and he understood why, and he was afraid for her, and he was afraid for me, even though I wasn't born yet. He knew about you. He suspected. He wrote that if Margaret had a child, that child would be the last one, the last Wyndham, and that everything he was doing was for that child as much as for Clement." She sat down on the bottom step of the staff stairs. "He never met me, no, but he thought about me, yes." Rosalie sat with that for a moment. Then she looked up. "What does Fitch know about my being here? Does he know I came down?" "I don't think so. Petra was careful about it. But he knows the court is pursuing the heir question. And if he's been managing the communication, he knows the heir has been located." How much time do we have before he moves? I don't know. The margin note was 8 months ago. He had a way to block the probate resolution. He would have used it by now. What he's doing is slowing things down, not stopping them. Every delay is another month where he has provisional control. If the heir shows up with documentation and a competent attorney. The delay strategy collapses, Delia said, 'cause the thing he's been protecting against, a fully informed heir with full documentation, is the thing he can't stop once it's in motion. Rosalie nodded slowly. I need to call Petra. She used Delia's disposable camera. Delia had bought a second one to photograph the documents herself, then carried the metal box carefully back upstairs and returned it to the cabinet shelf. She stood looking at the shelf of boxes for a moment. I'm not moving these yet, she said. Not until Petra says they're properly secured. That's what she told me too. How long have you been protecting this? 3 weeks I've been here. 2 days since I found it. Delia paused. I haven't told anyone in town. I haven't contacted the court or the genealogy firm. The only person I've spoken to is Petra, and she told me not to tell anyone else. Why? Small towns and money move information fast. And Fitch has ears. Rosalie looked at her steadily. You're 18 years old, and you've been managing this alone for 2 days. That's not long. It's long enough to get wrong. She was not being unkind. It was an assessment. The same kind of assessment Delia made about structures. It was long enough to make mistakes. You didn't. I tried not to, Delia said. Rosalie looked around the storage room one more time, then turned toward the stairs. Come have dinner with me. We need to talk about what happens next. They walked back through the carnival grounds in the failing afternoon light, through the gap in the fence, and Rosalie drove them to the diner on the main block in the car she'd driven from Columbus. A 4-year-old sedan with a car seat in the back that Delia noted but did not ask about. Sat in a booth near the window and ordered, and the waitress who came to take the order was not Diane, which was a relief, because Delia did not want anyone who had ever whispered about her in this diner to be present while she sat across from Rosalie Fenn. Rosalie called Petra while they waited for food, speaking in a low voice, listening, and then was quiet for a long moment. She says we need to move quickly, Rosalie said when she hung up. Fitch filed a motion 2 days ago to extend the provisional administration period for another 6 months on the grounds that the heir resolution is still pending. Court has a hearing on it in 12 days. Can Petra stop it? She says she can if she can file a counter motion establishing my standing as heir and demonstrating that the estate record is materially incomplete due to missing mineral rights documentation. She needs the assessment report and the deed. She needs them officially entered into the estate record before the hearing. How do we get them there legally? Rosalie folded her hands on the table. The documents are in the building. The building is in probate. As the prospective heir with standing, which Petra can file within 24 hours, I have the right to request access to estate property for the purpose of inventory and assessment. That access is formally granted by the court, witnessed by a court officer, and anything found during that access becomes part of the official estate record. So we go back in, officially. With a court officer and Petra present, yes. Rosalie looked at Delia. The documents don't leave without that framework. They did. Fitch's attorneys would challenge the chain of custody and tie it up for months. He blocked the access request. Can object to it, but as provisional administrator, he doesn't have grounds to deny an heir's right to inventory estate property. Standard probate procedure. When can Petra file? She's doing it tonight. Delia nodded. The food arrived. 2 plates of whatever was warmest on the menu. Pot roast for Rosalie, grilled cheese for Delia, the same grilled cheese she had eaten alone 3 weeks ago while 2 women whispered about her in the booth behind her. Town felt different now. Not because the town had changed, but because she was sitting somewhere different in it. The car seat, Rosalie said, following Delia's glance toward the window where the sedan was parked outside. My daughter. She's 3. She's with a neighbor in Columbus until I know how long this is going to take. What does she know about Carlow? Nothing yet. She's 3. Delia ate her grilled cheese. What do you do? She said. Columbus. I work for a nonprofit that does housing advocacy, helping people navigate tenant rights, eviction prevention, that kind of work. She said it without particular drama, but the look she gave Delia was the look of someone who knew exactly why she was telling her this, and was watching to see if Delia would understand. Delia understood. So you know what the system does to people who don't have resources, she said. Intimately. Rosalie cut her pot roast into precise pieces. My mother spent years without resources. Spent some years without them too. I know what it is to fight an unfair process with no tools. She looked up. I also know what it feels like when someone gives you the tool before you knew you needed it. She held Delia's gaze. I owe you something for this. You don't owe me anything, Delia said. I found something that wasn't mine, and I made sure it got to the person it belonged to. But you protected it for 2 days at some personal risk when you could have done nothing. That's not nothing. Delia shrugged. It needed doing. Rosalie put down her fork. I want to ask you something, and I want you to know you can say no. Okay, what do you need? Right now, what do you need? Delia looked at her plate. It was an unusual question. Was the kind of question she was rarely asked directly because most people either didn't ask it or asked it in a way that was more about making themselves feel useful than about actually listening to the answer. Phone, she said. Right now, practically, a phone so I can be reached and can reach people. Stable place to sleep until this is resolved. After that, I don't know. Those things I can handle tonight, Rosalie said. Delia looked up. I mean it. Rosalie's voice was straightforward, not performing generosity. You're the person who found what my great-grandfather hid and made sure it reached me instead of Fitch. The least I can do is make sure you're not sleeping in my family's funhouse while we untangle this. Delia was quiet for a moment. She was not good at receiving things. She was aware of this. It was something that happened when you spent long enough doing entirely without. You lost the muscle for it. The ability to let something good come in without immediately assessing whether it was too good to be real. She thought about Dale. About the day he had handed her a set of electrician's tools and said, "These are yours now." Just like that, no ceremony. And she had stood holding them, not knowing what to say, and he had looked at her and said, "You don't have to say anything. Just learn them." The receiving was in the learning. "Okay," she said. "Thank you." After dinner, Rosalie drove to the motel on the highway and checked in, and in the morning she came back to the hardware store with a prepaid smartphone, still boxed, and handed it across the counter to Delia, while Bette pretended to be absorbed in an invoice. "That's for you," Rosalie said. "Petra needs to be able to reach us both directly." Delia opened the box and set it up while Rosalie watched. Bette said nothing. Then Bette said, without looking up from the invoice, "Is it the mineral rights?" Both of them turned to look at her. "I've lived in this town for 19 years, Bette said. "I've watched Fitch circle that property like a dog. Circles of food it's not sure about eating. He's been too interested for too long for it to be about the surface value." She finally looked up. The Wyndham land sits on the same formation as the Hartley leases 2 counties over. Those have been producing since 2009. "I'm a hardware store owner in a small town, not an idiot." Rosalie looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "Yes, the mineral rights." Bette nodded once, as if something she had long suspected had been confirmed. She returned her attention to the invoice. "Good," she said. "Get it sorted before he does." Petra drove in from Columbus the following morning, and they met at the diner, all three of them. The attorney spreading papers across the table with the businesslike efficiency of someone who had 12 days to move something that had been stuck for 5 years. She was in her 40s, compact and precise, with reading glasses she wore on top of her head and brought down only when she needed to look at something closely. "I've filed the standing motion," Petra said. "The court should acknowledge it within 48 hours. Then I file for estate inventory access." Fitch tries to block either. He overplays his hand in front of the judge, which I am actually hoping for. "What's the risk?" Rosalie said. "That he moves on the property before we can secure the documents. Specifically, that he uses his provisional administrator status to authorize some kind of inspection or improvement work that would require accessing the building, during which the hidden compartment gets found or the storage room gets emptied." "He doesn't know about the compartment," Delia said. "He doesn't know what's in it," Petra said. "He suspects documents exist somewhere in that building. A well-timed work order would give him a reason to send people through it." "How do we stop that? We move faster than him." She's looked at Delia. "You said the service door lock is a standard deadbolt that you've been working open." "Yes." "Does it show any sign of being tampered with?" "No, I've been careful." "When was the last time anyone other than you and Rosalie was on that property?" "As far as I know, no one has been inside since Clement closed it. The trailers are dusty, untouched. Inside the funhouse there's no sign of recent entry except mine." Petra considered this. "I'm going to request the court inventory access hearing for the earliest possible date. I'll frame it as time-sensitive given the pending extension motion. I can get a hearing date before Fitch's extension motion is heard. We establish the documentation first, and his motion becomes moot." Rosalie nodded. "What do you need from me?" "Sworn statement of your identity, your family history as you know it, and your intent to claim the estate. I'll take that today." And Petra turned to Delia. "I need your statement too. What you found, when you found it, exactly what you did and didn't do. Chain of custody starts with you." Delia gave it. Sitting in the diner booth with Petra's recorder running, walking through every step from the night she first entered the building to the moment she handed Rosalie the hex key, she was precise. She left nothing out, including the fact that she'd been trespassing, because Petra had already told her that honesty in the statement mattered more than self-protection, and because she was not someone who omitted in inconvenient things when the truth was being taken down for a record. When she finished, Petra reviewed the recorder, made 2 notes, and said, "You're going to be a credible witness," which is going to matter when Fitch's attorneys try to argue contaminated chain of custody. Will they? "We'll try everything," Petra said. "What they won't be able to change is what the documents say, or where they were found, or the notary stamp on that mineral rights deed." She closed her notes. "A deed notarized in 2003, hidden in a structure that hasn't been accessed since 2007, found under circumstances that are on the record. That's not something you can argue away in front of a competent judge." "Unless the judge," Rosalie said, "has Fitch connections, yes." Petra's expression was flat. "That's why I've been researching the judicial assignment. The hearing will be in front of Judge Mira Alcott, who has been on the probate bench for 11 years and has reversed 2 previous decisions in cases where provisional administrators were found to be acting in self-interest. She is not someone who is going to be patient with delay tactics." For the first time since she'd found the journal, Delia felt something unlock in her chest. Not hope exactly. She had learned too long ago to be careful with hope, but a sense that the machinery was in order, that the pieces were where they needed to be. 48 hours of waiting for the court acknowledgement were strange. Delia worked. She finished the tile job for Bette started a gutter replacement on a 2-story on the south side, walked past the Carnival property twice a day to check the fence and the gate without going in. Rosalie drove back to Columbus to get her daughter. Returned the next day with a small girl named Clara, who had her mother's dark curly hair and a curiosity about everything that expressed itself as a constant stream of questions. What's that? What's that for? Why is that like that? What happened to that? Rosalie answered every one of them with the particular patience of a parent who had decided very early that questions deserved real answers. Delia watched them at the diner while Clara interrogated the architecture of the sugar dispenser and thought about what it would be like to have had that, to have had someone in your corner who thought your questions were worth answering. She did not let herself stay in that thought too long. On the second morning, Petra called. Court acknowledged the standing motion, she said. Inventory access hearing is scheduled for 5 days from now. Fitch has filed an objection to the standing motion on the grounds that the DNA verification isn't complete. That legitimate? Rosalie said. They were both on the call, speakerphone on Delia's new phone on the diner table. It's a tactic. DNA verification is standard and it's underway, it just takes time. Objection essentially asks the court to delay the inventory access until verification is complete, which would take us past his extension motion hearing. Petra's voice was steady. Filing a response today arguing that DNA verification doesn't affect the right to inventory estate property, that the heir's standing is sufficiently established for the purpose of a supervised inventory, and that the delay would prejudice her interests given the pending extension motion. Can he keep doing this? Keep filing things to slow it down, as long as the judge allows it. But Alcott has already denied 2 delay motions in the last year on other cases. She doesn't like what she calls procedural obstruction. Petra paused, starting to look like someone who has a reason to not want this resolved. Good, said Rosalie quietly. The morning of the inventory access hearing, Delia woke in the motel room Rosalie had been covering and lay in the still dark for a moment, feeling the unfamiliar quality of a real mattress under her, the particular silence of a room that was hers alone. She thought about the morning 3 weeks ago when she had woken on the Funhouse storage room cot and done her survival arithmetic, and how different the arithmetic looked now. Not because she had money, she still had almost none, but because she was in the middle of something that had a direction and a logic and people she was accountable to, and who were accountable to her. That was what she had been missing, she thought. Not money, accountability, feeling of mattering to something beyond your own next meal. The hearing was in Hargrove, at the county probate court, a building that smelled like carpet cleaner and processed air. Rosalie sat at the petitioner's table with Petra. Delia sat in the gallery. Gerald Fitch was at the respondent's table with 2 attorneys she did not recognize, both of them in suits that were more expensive than anything she had ever been proximate to. Fitch was in his 60s, tall and thin-faced, with the kind of silver hair that looked deliberate. He had the bearing of someone who had spent decades being the largest personality in every room he occupied in this county, and the brief look he directed toward the gallery when he sat down was the look of a man assessing a room for threats and not finding any. He did not look at Delia long enough to assess her. Judge Alcott was not a large woman, but she had a presence that reorganized the room around her when she sat. She had reading glasses and a manner that was brisk without being unkind. She heard both arguments. Petra's was concise and well-structured. The heir's standing was established, the inventory was standard procedure, and the delay request was prejudicial. Fitch's attorneys argued the DNA question and the need for proper verification. and used phrases like due diligence and established protocol and the integrity of the process in a way that was designed to sound responsible and was actually designed to sound like nothing in particular for as long as possible. Judge Alcott listened to both and made notes. Then she looked at Fitch over her glasses. "Mr. Fitch," she said, "you were appointed provisional administrator how long ago?" 2 years and 4 months, one of his attorneys said, "and in that time the estate has not been moved through probate." "There are complexities," the attorney said. "There are complexities," Judge Alcott repeated. "What I'm seeing in the record is a series of delay motions and extension requests going back to the first year of your appointment. Can you tell me why this estate hasn't been resolved in 5 years?" There was a pause. "DNA question has been pending." "The DNA question arose 4 months ago," Judge Alcott said. "Before that, why the delays?" Another pause. "The estate value was difficult to assess. Has a formal assessment been ordered?" "Preliminary one, yes." The attorney shuffled papers. "In 2021. "I'm looking at the 2021 assessment," Alcott said. "Values the property at approximately $400,000, primarily the land and structures with the Carnival equipment included." She looked up. "That seems like a fairly straightforward valuation. What was the difficulty?" Fitch's attorney had the look of someone who had prepared for many questions, and not quite for this one. "There were complications with the title," he said. Alcott looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned to Petra. "Counsel, you've indicated in your filing that the estate record may be materially incomplete. Can you be more specific?" Petra stood. "Your Honor, we have reason to believe the estate record does not include a separate mineral rights instrument that was created in 2003 and is physically present on the estate property. We are requesting supervised inventory access to locate and properly record that instrument." "Mineral rights instrument," Alcott said. "Yes, Your Honor. We believe its existence materially changes the estate valuation, and therefore the nature of the proceeding." There was a silence in the courtroom. Delia, in the gallery, watched Fitch. He did not move, but something in his expression altered. A very slight tightening around the eyes, the look of someone who has heard something they did not know was coming and is revising their assessment of the situation at speed. He knows, Delia thought. Not about the compartment, not about the exact documents, but he knows what a mineral rights instrument on the Wyndham property would mean. He's known it was a possibility. And he's been sitting on the estate for 5 years, hoping no one found it. Judge Alcott made a note. "Petition for supervised inventory access is granted. I'm scheduling it for 3 days from now." She looked at Fitch's table. "Provisional administrator is directed to facilitate access and to refrain from entering the property prior to the scheduled inventory date. Any entry prior to that date will be treated as interference with estate proceedings." She held Fitch's gaze for a moment that lasted slightly longer than necessary. "Are we clear, Mr. Fitch?" Attorney said, "Yes, Your Honor." Delia sat in the gallery and let out a breath she had not known she was holding. Outside the courthouse, Petra checked her phone and then looked at both of them with an expression that was the closest thing to satisfaction Delia had seen on her controlled face. "He didn't know about the mineral rights document," Petra said, "or he didn't know we knew about it. Either way, his attorneys came in today, expecting to stall another inventory request, and the judge put him on notice in open court. He's going to be scrambling." "Will he try to get into the building before the inventory date?" Rosalie said. "Alcott just told him not to. He'd be in contempt." "That doesn't mean he won't," Delia said. Petra looked at her. "No, doesn't." She put her phone away. "I'm going to contact the court officer and ask to move the inventory date up if there's any availability. I'd suggest one of you or someone you trust be at that property tonight." Rosalie looked at Delia. I'll be there, Delia said. She spent the next 2 nights in the Funhouse storage room, sleeping lightly, the new phone charged and closed. On the first night, nothing happened. She woke twice from the kind of shallow survival sleep she had developed on the streets, listening for footsteps, hearing nothing but the building settling and the wind in the oaks. On the second night, at 2:30 in the morning, headlights swept through the gap in the fence. She was on her feet before she fully woke, moving to the window, keeping back from the glass. The vehicle had pulled off the road along the fence line, and its headlights were now off. She could see the shape of it in the moonlight. A truck, large, dark-colored. 2 figures got out. She called Petra's cell. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. She tried Rosalie. Rosalie answered on the second ring, voice alert and not sleepy. "What? Somebody's here. 2 people, a truck. Just came through the fence line." Delia's voice was steady. She had learned from Dale that panic was a gear you shifted out of as fast as possible because panic cost you time you couldn't afford. "Are you safe?" Rosalie said. "I'm in the storage room. They're on the grounds, not in the building yet. Can you call the police and Petra simultaneously?" Already dialing. "Stay on the line with me." Delia listened to Rosalie's side of the call to 911, steady and precise, giving the address and the situation. Below her, through the storage room floor, she could not hear footsteps in the main building. The oak floors were thick. The building was well insulated, but she could see, through the single window, the faint movement of a flashlight beam beyond the funhouse exterior. "They're circling the building," she said quietly. "Stay where you are," Rosalie said. "Don't confront them. Police are 7 minutes out. 7 minutes." The funhouse service door had the deadbolt, which she had locked from inside. The main double doors were chained from outside. The only other way in was the windows, all of which were boarded. She did the geometry of the situation. She was in a sound building with no easy entrance, and the 2 figures outside did not appear to know about the service entrance. They were moving along the exterior perimeter, looking for the most obvious way in. She waited. The flashlight beam passed the window twice. It moved away toward the back of the building, toward the trailers. 3 minutes. 2. Blue and red light came through the window, diffused through the trees, then sharpening as a patrol car came up the access road. She heard voices outside, the particular tonal shift of people who had been doing something they shouldn't, and were now being addressed by someone with authority. More voices, a car door. Her phone buzzed. "Rosalie, they're talking to the police. Stay inside until I call you." He stayed inside. 20 minutes later, Rosalie's headlights were in the access road, and Delia came out the service door and stood on the frost-hard gravel in the cold. 2 officers were by their cruiser with the 2 figures from the truck, both of them men in their 40s, both of them wearing the kind of workwear that said they were presenting themselves as contractors. One of them was doing most of the talking. The other one was looking at the ground. Delia stood with Rosalie and listened. The talking one said they had been hired by the Provisional Estate Administrator to do a structural assessment of the Carnival buildings. He produced a work order. One of the officers took it and read it. "This is dated today," the officer said. "Yes, sir." In the middle of the night. The talking one hesitated. "We had other jobs today. This was the first opportunity." The second officer was already on his radio. Rosalie had her phone out, recording. "Is Fitch going to be charged with contempt?" Delia said quietly. Rosalie was watching the scene, her jaw tight. "Petra's going to argue for it. Whether the judge agrees depends on whether she believes this was intentional violation of her order or a coincidence of scheduling." She paused. "It was not a coincidence of scheduling." "No," Delia said. "But the more important thing is that he didn't get in." Rosalie turned to look at the funhouse behind them, its dark bulk against the sky. Whatever he was looking for is still in there, still safe, still safe. Stood in the cold together, watching the officers work through the work order question, and somewhere out in the oaks the crow was going again. The same crow or one like it, calling into the dark without waiting for an answer. Inventory access day arrived 4 days later. Petra had succeeded in moving it up by 48 hours, arguing to the court's administrative clerk that the nighttime incident constituted grounds for expedited action. Judge Alcott, briefed on the incident, had agreed. Fitch had filed a response characterizing the workers as legitimately authorized contractors and the incident as a misunderstanding. Alcott's clerk had replied with a 2-line note that said, in effect, that the hearing was moved regardless. The court officer assigned to the inventory was a man named Dale Pressler. The coincidence of the first name made Delia stop for a moment when she heard it. A brief interior flicker she did not let become anything. He was methodical and professionally incurious, which was exactly what was needed. He was there to witness and document, not to assess. They went through the service door, all 4 of them, Delia, Rosalie, Petra, and Dale Pressler. The flashlight beams moved through the corridor of mirrors, the 100 reflections multiplying around them. Delia led them to the main floor and to the fortune teller's cabinet and got down on the floor and worked the panel release and opened it. Dale Pressler leaned over to look into the cedar-lined space and made a note on his clipboard. Delia lifted the metal box out and set it on the platform edge. Petra put on nitrile gloves and opened it. She removed the deed and the letter and laid them on the platform, photographed them with a professional camera, and then placed them in archival sleeves she had brought. "This is the mineral rights instrument," Petra said to Pressler. "Deed conveying mineral rights in perpetuity to the Wyndham Family Trust. Notarized February 28, 2003. Do you see the notary stamp?" Pressler leaned in, looked, and made a note. "This is a letter from the property's original owner to his son and subsequent heirs, describing the instrument and its location." Pressler made another note. "This is your claim," he said to Rosalie. "It's my family's," Rosalie said. "Yes." Pressler looked at her for a moment and then back at his clipboard. "For the record," he said, "the item designated in this inventory as Item 1, being a mineral rights deed, was found in a concealed compartment within the central mechanical housing of the fortune-telling apparatus on the main floor of the Carnival Funhouse structure, Wyndham property, Carlow, Ohio. It is being placed into the custody of counsel for the estate beneficiary pending probate resolution." He signed his note, dated it, and handed his clipboard to Petra to countersign. She did. Delia stood and looked at the deed in its archival sleeve. Harlan's work, done quietly and alone in the last year of his life, hidden in the center of the thing he had built with his own hands, waiting 21 years for the right person to find it. She looked at Rosalie, who was looking at the deed with an expression Delia was beginning to recognize. That particular quality of receiving something you had not known you were owed, something coming in across the gap you had thought was permanent. Spent another hour in the storage room, inventorying the boxes. Every document was logged by Pressler and placed in archival custody. Callaway Geoscience's assessment report, when it appeared, made Pressler's pen pause for a moment over his clipboard, though he said nothing. When they were done, they came back downstairs and stood in the main floor of the funhouse for a moment before leaving. The winter light came pale through the boarded windows. The mirrors caught it and passed it around the room, the reflections quiet and still. Rosalie looked at the fortune teller's cabinet, the cracked painted face, the hands extended over the crystal ball. "He chose this," she said. "This building, this location. Not by accident." "No," Delia said. "He built what he thought was worth keeping, and he put what mattered most at the center of it." Rosalie was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up her bag and walked toward the door, and Delia followed, and Dale Presler followed, and Petra was last, pausing in the corridor of mirrors to look back at the main floor one more time before the door swung closed behind them. Outside, the November air was sharp and clean, and the frost on the carnival grounds caught the morning light. Whatever came next, the hearing, the assessment, the numbers, the fight that Fitch's attorneys would almost certainly mount, the whole slow machinery of a legal resolution that would take months before it produced anything final, whatever came next, the documents were out of the walls. The thing Harlan had built his faith around was in the open. The right people had it. Delia stood for a moment in the morning light and thought about Dale, about the condemned house, about what he had said. Somebody should have stood up for this sooner. Somebody had now. She picked up her bag and walked with the others to where the cars were parked by the road, and the crow called once from somewhere in the oaks and then was quiet, and the day moved on. Extension motion hearing was 8 days after the inventory. Petra spent those 8 days building what she described to Rosalie and Delia, over the phone and in person at the diner, as the cleanest case she had assembled in 14 years of probate law. The mineral rights deed was now formally entered into the estate record. Callaway Geosciences assessment was entered alongside it. Current geology firm out of Columbus, retained by Petra on an expedited basis, had been given access to the assessment and the underlying survey data, and had provided a preliminary updated valuation that confirmed what Harlan had feared and hoped in equal measure. The formation beneath the Wyndham property had been significantly de-risked by the 15 years of adjacent development in the Utica shale trend, and the recoverable resource estimate, updated to current market conditions, was substantially larger than the 2003 figure. The number Petra read to them in the diner on the morning before the hearing was not one that Delia tried to process as a number. She understood it the way she understood the weight of a structural beam, not by computing it abstractly, but by feeling what it implied about everything around it. Implied that 5 years of Gerald Fitch's provisional administration had been the longest sustained act of self-interested obstruction in the county's probate history. Implied that Rosalie Fenn, who had almost not responded to the genealogy firm's letter, who had driven down to Carlow with careful composure and a car seat in her sedan, was about to have a life that looked entirely different from the one she had woken up to 3 weeks ago. Implied a great many things about what the Wyndham Carnival grounds were worth and what Gerald Fitch had understood them to be worth for years, while he filed delay motions and extension requests and sat in his provisional administrator's chair collecting oversight fees. Rosalie received the number the way she received most things, steadily, without performance. She sat with it for a moment. Then she said, "My great-grandfather was right to be frightened." "Yes," Petra said, "right to hide it." At the hearing, Gerald Fitch's attorneys did not attempt to argue the extension motion with their original strategy. It was clear from the moment Petra stood to present the estate's updated valuation that the strategy was no longer viable. What they attempted instead was a challenge to the mineral rights deed itself, arguing that a 2003 document hidden in a concealed compartment and never properly recorded in the county land records could not be considered a legitimate instrument. The chain of title was broken, that the proper process for establishing mineral rights required formal county recording, and that Harlan Wyndham's failure to complete that recording invalidated the deed. Was, Petra told them afterward, not an entirely without merit argument. Was the argument she would have expected a competent attorney to make, and she had prepared for it. She presented, in response, 2 things. The first was an Ohio Supreme Court decision from 2009 establishing that a properly notarized mineral rights instrument remained valid between parties regardless of county recording. That recording was a protection against subsequent third-party claims, but not a requirement of validity between grantor and grantee, and that the Wyndham Family Trust, as named grantee, held valid title to the mineral rights under the instrument regardless of the recording gap. The second was a certified copy of a letter found in the storage room's correspondence files and entered into the estate record during the inventory, from a title company in Columbus dated March 15, 2003. 2 weeks after the deed's notarization, confirming receipt of the original deed for recording purposes, and assigning a recording transaction number. The title company had been acquired and dissolved over subsequent years and its records scattered, as Delia had noted in her reading of the probate history. But the letter confirming receipt and assigning the transaction number was dated and certified. The recording had been initiated. The failure to complete it was not Harlan's failure. Judge Alcott looked at the letter. She looked at Fitch's attorneys. She asked whether they had any evidence that the title company had failed to complete the recording through any fault of Harlan Wyndham's. Did not. She denied the extension motion. She appointed Petra as successor administrator of the estate, replacing Fitch effective immediately. She ordered a full audit of the provisional administration period, which meant 5 years of Fitch's management of estate assets would be reviewed by an independent examiner, which meant, as Petra explained quietly to Rosalie in the courthouse hallway afterward, that whatever fees he had collected and whatever decisions he had made in those 5 years were now subject to scrutiny that he had spent 5 years avoiding. Fitch left the courthouse without looking at any of them. His attorneys followed him at a slight distance, the way people follow someone who has just received news they are still processing. Rosalie stood in the courthouse hallway with Clara on her hip. She had brought her daughter today, wanting her to be present for something, even if Clara was too young to understand what, and looked at Petra with an expression that was not triumph. It was quieter than triumph. It was the look of someone who has been carrying a weight they didn't know they were carrying and has just set it down. "It's over," Rosalie said. "The hearing is over. The legal process is not. There will be a full probate resolution, a formal estate accounting, negotiations with mineral extraction companies, tax implications that will take a specialist to navigate." She paused. "It will be months before any of it is final. But the path is clear now. No one can obstruct it." Rosalie nodded. Clara pulled at a strand of her mother's hair and said something that was not quite a word, and Rosalie absently unwound it from her daughter's fingers without looking. Delia stood slightly apart from them in the hallway, her back to the wall, the new phone in her pocket. She had not said anything since the hearing ended. She was thinking about the drive back to Carlow, about the Funhouse, and what it would be now that the documents were out of the walls, and the legal question was turning toward resolution. She was thinking about Bette and the hardware store, and the jobs that were still waiting, the gutter replacement not quite finished, a porch repair she'd been quoted on yesterday. She was thinking about what came next in the way she always thought about what came next, which was practically, arithmetically, without sentimentality. She had $118. She had a prepaid phone. She had skills and no credentials. She had a town where she had a small reputation for good work, and a woman named Bette, who let her sleep on a pull-out when it was available, and had given her coffee money on the first morning, and hadn't made a thing of it. She had been in Carlow for 6 weeks. She was 18 years old. Rosalie turned and looked at her. "Come have lunch," she said. "You and me and Clara, before we drive back." They ate at a restaurant near the courthouse that was nicer than the diner, the kind of place, with cloth napkins, and a menu that described things in more words than they needed. Clara was given a paper placemat and crayons and became entirely absorbed in coloring a cartoon lobster, leaving Delia and Rosalie to talk across the table with the particular ease of two people who have been through something together and are now sitting in the aftermath of it. "I want to talk to you about something," Rosalie said, "and I want you to hear it out before you say anything." "Okay, I've been thinking about what to do with the property. Not the mineral rights. Those will be leased. That's straightforward. There are established processes. I mean the surface, the carnival grounds, the funhouse, the structures." She set down her fork. "I own 120 acres on the eastern edge of a small Ohio town. Most of it is undeveloped. Carnival has been closed for 17 years. Sitting in the middle of it is a building that is, according to you, one of the soundest structures you've ever been in." Delia said nothing because Rosalie had asked her to hear it out. "I work in housing advocacy," Rosalie said. "I have for 6 years. I know the gap between what exists for people who fall through every system there is, aging out of foster care, transitional housing that has conditions they can't meet, the way one bad week becomes a month, becomes a year, becomes the thing that defines you to everyone who looks at you." She held Delia's gaze. "I know that gap because I've watched people fall into it my whole career. Now I've met someone who fell into it and who, instead of being diminished by it, spent 3 weeks learning a town and found what no one else found in 5 years of legal proceedings." Delia looked at the cloth napkin in her lap. "That's not what happened. It's exactly what happened. Paid attention, and you did the work, and you didn't walk away." Rosalie's voice was even, not performing emotion. "I'm not saying it to flatter you. I'm saying it because it matters to what I want to propose." "What do you want to propose?" Rosalie was quiet for a moment, choosing her words. "Want to do something with that property that my great-grandfather would recognize. Built the funhouse because he wanted something permanent at the center. He wanted something that would outlast the season, outlast the tents and the trailers. He wanted something that meant the carnival wasn't just a thing that passed through, but a thing that stayed." She paused. "I want to build something that stays." "What kind of something?" "Housing. Real housing, not transitional with conditions and curfews and mandatory group sessions. Housing for people who have fallen through the gap, specifically young people coming out of foster care or off the streets, with support services built in, but not mandatory in the punitive sense. Place where you can stay while you figure out what you're doing next without a 72-hour countdown before they give your bed away." She looked at Delia. "I want to build it in and around the funhouse. The building's already sound. You said so yourself. The acreage supports additional structures. Town is small, but there are jobs, there's a school, there's Bette's hardware store." She let that sit for a moment. "I want to use what Harlan left to build what he actually meant." Delia looked at her. "I want you to run the construction," Rosalie said, "not as a day laborer, as the project lead. You know the building better than anyone. You know what it needs. You know buildings generally, in a way that I can see, isn't common in someone your age, and I want to know why I'd hire someone else." "I don't have credentials," Delia said. Rosalie made a face that was not quite impatience. "Neither did most of the people who built the original structure. My great-grandfather built the funhouse himself, starting in 1961, because he'd learned from his father. And his father had learned from whoever taught him. Credentials are for insurance purposes, and there are ways to handle insurance purposes." She folded her hands on the table. "I want someone who knows what they're doing and who has a stake in the outcome. I would have a stake in it. Yes, you'd live there when the housing is operational. if you want to. Part of what you're paid. A unit, not charity, not a donation, not a pullout in a back office. Place that's yours. Delia looked out the restaurant window at the street, the winter light coming gray and clean between the buildings. She thought about the $47 and the garbage bag and the bus ticket. She thought about Joanna at the family services desk not quite meeting her eyes. She thought about the gutter replacement and the tile job and Dale's tools in her hands and the feeling of a floor that was solid because she had made it solid. She thought about Harlan Wyndham, who had built something permanent because he believed in the idea of permanence and had hidden what mattered most inside it, and had written in a rust-colored hand to whoever came next. "I need to think about it," Delia said. "Take whatever time you need." Drove back to Carlow. Clara fell asleep in the car seat within 5 minutes of leaving the parking garage and slept all the way to town, which Rosalie said was unusual, and suggested the day had been more stimulating than her daughter wanted to admit. Drove in companionable quiet, the highway unrolling flat and gray through fallow farmland, the sky the color of old pewter in the west where the light was going. Delia asked, somewhere on the highway, what was your mother like? Rosalie was quiet for a moment. She was careful, she said, not in a fearful way. In the way of someone who has looked at where carelessness leads and decided to be the opposite of that. She was a very attentive person. She paid attention to things. She paused. When she was dying, she talked about Carlow more than she had in my whole life. Not stories exactly, more like she wanted to acknowledge that it existed, that she had come from somewhere. She told you to go if you had a reason. She did. Rosalie glanced at the road. She also told me not to be afraid of what was ours. Psh! She said that was a lesson she'd learned too late, and she wanted me to have it earlier. Do you think she knew what was there? I think she knew there was something. Whether she knew the specifics, I don't know. Harlan never told Clement the full picture, and Clement never told Margaret because she was gone by the time Clement knew anything. But she knew the property was worth more than it looked. She paused. She just didn't believe she had the right to go and claim it. That was the fear she was apologizing for. Not leaving Carlow. Believing she didn't deserve to go back. Delia looked out the window at the fallow fields. She understood that, the specific quality of that fear, the way it could calcify into permanent absence. She understood it from the inside. They drove the rest of the way in quiet. Clara slept. The light died in the west. Delia spent 2 days thinking about Rosalie's proposal, finished replacement, and started the porch repair, and let the question sit in the back of her mind the way problems needed to sit before they became clear. She walked past the Carnival property once each day, not going in, just looking at the funhouse through the trees. The chevrons faded, but the structure solid, the peaked roof against the sky. On the second evening, she walked to the motel and knocked on Rosalie's door. "Yes," she said, "I want to do it." Rosalie opened the door wider and let her in. The process of turning the Wyndham property into something habitable was not fast. Delia had not expected it to be. Rosalie's work in housing advocacy had given her a clear-eyed view of what permitting and zoning and building codes required, and she spent the first months navigating those requirements while Delia drew plans. Actual drawn plans, on paper, the way Dale had taught her, room by room, structure by structure, beginning with the funhouse. The funhouse needed less than Delia had expected, because the bones were as good as she had said. The main floor was cleared of the Carnival equipment, most of it removed and catalogued. Some pieces saved because Rosalie said they were worth preserving as the history of the place. And the floor was refinished, the walls stripped to the original wood paneling, which was beautiful beneath 40 years of paint and decoration. The mirrors were taken down carefully and cleaned, and some of them reinstalled in the corridor because Rosalie said she wanted the building to remember what it had been. The second floor was redesigned as living units, 4 of them, small but private, each with its own entrance and bathroom. The cedar-lined cabinet in the storage room was preserved as it was, mounted and lit, the documents inside it replaced with photographs of the originals. A small placard said what it had held and when it had been found. The trailers were removed. The lot was cleared. 3 additional structures were built over 18 months on the cleared land, small cluster housing, nothing elaborate. The kind of functional and well-built construction that Dale had taught her was the only kind worth doing. Each unit had a real door that locked from the inside. Each had a window that opened. It had enough space for a person to be alone in it. Delia hired from the town when she could. Purcell, the carpenter who worked out of a shop on the highway, came on as the framing lead, after she'd watched him work for a week and confirmed he was someone who believed in square corners. A woman named Simone, 22, who had been doing drywall work seasonally, came on full-time, 2 more, a small crew. She paid them properly, which she could do, because Rosalie had established a development budget from the estate that was more than adequate once the mineral rights lease negotiations were underway. The lease negotiations were their own long process, managed by Petra and a specialist energy attorney from Columbus. 3 extraction companies submitted proposals. The terms that Petra ultimately recommended involved a royalty structure rather than a flat sale, which meant the Wyndham estate would receive a percentage of production value over the life of the wells rather than a one-time payment. The one-time number that 2 of the companies had offered was large enough to be disorienting. The royalty structure over a 20-year production period based on current geological estimates was larger by a significant margin. Rosalie accepted the royalty structure. She told Petra, "My great-grandfather didn't sell. I'm not selling either." The audit of Fitch's provisional administration took 7 months. Found, not surprisingly, that he had collected fees beyond what was authorized, had made decisions about the estate's maintenance expenditures that benefited companies he had an interest in, and had managed the communication with the genealogy firm and subsequently with Rosalie in ways designed to minimize her engagement with the estate. Audit findings were referred to the county prosecutor. Fitch's attorneys negotiated a resolution that involved restitution, disbarment from future estate administration appointments, and a civil settlement with the estate that returned a substantial sum to the Wyndham Trust. Did not go to prison. Delia noted this without particular surprise. The world was not organized in a way that reliably sent men like Gerald Fitch to prison. What it did, when the machinery worked correctly, was remove his access to the thing he'd been using, return what he'd taken, and make it expensive and visible enough to function as a deterrent to the next provisional administrator who thought the Alcott probate court wasn't paying attention. Delia thought about Harlan's margin note, all options. She thought about what Fitch's version of all options had looked like for 5 years, and what it had ultimately produced, and was satisfied that the outcome, while imperfect, was a version of justice that an old man who had believed in careful patience might have recognized. The first residents arrived in the spring of the 2nd year, when the Funhouse units were complete and 2 of the additional structures were finished. Rosalie had worked with county social services and 2 Columbus nonprofits to identify young people in exactly the gap she had described. Aging out of care, unstable housing, the particular combination of capability and circumstance that meant they could be fine if given a place and a margin and time to establish themselves, but who had none of those things. There were 6 of them at first, 4 women and 2 men, ages 18 to 22, came with garbage bags and backpacks, and the carefully composed expressions of people who had learned not to display need, not to be too visibly hopeful about a thing in case it was taken away. Delia recognized every one of those expressions. She had worn them all. She showed each person to their unit herself. Not Rosalie, not the social worker from Columbus, not anyone else. Delia, in work boots with paint on her jeans from finishing a door frame that morning, who said, "This is yours. The lock is a deadbolt. Here's the key. It is not a spare. There is no other copy. This key is yours." She said it to each of them. "This key is yours." One of them, a woman named Tara, who was 19 and had been in 7 placements since she was 9, stood in the doorway of her unit for a long moment before she went in. She was looking at the room as if she was doing what Delia did with buildings, assessing the structure, checking whether it would hold. Delia stood in the doorway and let her look. After a while, Tara said, "You built this, most of it, with a crew. Why?" Delia thought about this. "Because I stayed in the Funhouse one winter and found something that needed to reach the right person. And the right person wanted to do something with it that made sense." She paused. "And because somebody taught me that good bones are worth building on." Tara looked at her. She went inside and closed the door, and Delia heard the deadbolt turn from the inside, and she stood in the hallway for a moment listening to the sound of it. Bette came to the opening event Rosalie organized that spring, along with a contingent from the town that was larger than Delia expected. Carlow had watched the construction with the particular attention of a small town watching something unfamiliar happening in its midst, and opinions had run from enthusiastic to skeptical in roughly equal proportion, with a significant middle ground of people who were waiting to see before deciding. Opening event brought most of them to the Carnival grounds, which had been cleaned and partially landscaped, the old light poles rewired and lit. The Funhouse entrance restored with its wooden marquee repaired and newly lettered. The new marquee said, "Wyndham's," just that. Rosalie had decided it. Bette stood in the main floor of the funhouse with a glass of something and looked at the restored wood paneling and the lit mirrors and said without preamble, "You did good work in here." "Thank you," Delia said. "The bones were good." They were. Bette looked at her over the glass. "What are you going to do now?" "The construction is mostly done." Delia looked around the room. "There's maintenance, ongoing. There's the 3rd building that still needs finishing. After that, I don't know yet." She paused. "I've been thinking about getting my contractor's license. Properly. There are programs." "Good," Bette said. Then she added, in the manner of someone for whom this was a simple, factual statement rather than an offer, "There's work at the shop for someone with a contractor's license who knows buildings. If you want it." Delia looked at her. "Thank you." Bette made the non-committal sound she made when acknowledgement was unnecessary and moved toward the table where Carol from the church had laid out food. Rosalie found Delia later, outside on the Carnival grounds in the evening light. Clara was running across the open space between the funhouse and the nearest housing structure, chasing something only a 3-year-old could see, stopping periodically to investigate a piece of gravel or a tuft of new grass with the focused intensity of a scientist who has not yet decided which problems are worth solving. Rosalie stood beside Delia and they watched Clara for a moment. "She loves it here," Rosalie said. "She's 3. She loves anything with space to run. She loves it here specifically. She asks about it on the weeks we're in Columbus. She calls it the Mirror House." Rosalie smiled. "She's going to understand what it is when she's older, and I think it's going to matter to her that she was here from the beginning." "Are you moving here?" Delia said. "You and Clara." "Part-time for now. I need to be in Columbus for the work. But yes." Rosalie looked toward the funhouse, its lit windows warm against the evening. My great-grandfather built this place because he believed in permanence. My grandfather kept it because he loved it. My mother left it behind because she was afraid. She paused. I'm not going to be the generation that stays away. Delia nodded. She thought about Margaret Wyndham, 18 years old in 1988. Leaving a town and a family and a property that held more than anyone around her had known how to tell her.
Bottle!
She thought about the fear that had kept Margaret away for the rest of her life and the letter she had written at the end, asking forgiveness for it. She thought about how much distance a person could put between themselves and something that was theirs, and how long that distance could last, and what it cost. She thought about what it had taken to close that distance. A genealogy firm, a letter, a phone call from a stranger, a drive down a highway to look at a building someone else had spent 3 weeks in. She thought about how much of it had depended on things that had no reason to go the way they had gone. The bus ticket that had taken her to Carlow specifically, the broken bolt on the service door, the fence post worked loose from its footer, the night she had needed somewhere to be for 3 hours. She did not believe in fate. Dale had not believed in fate either. He had believed in attention and in what he called the willingness to stay with a problem until it revealed itself. He had believed that most things that looked like luck were actually the product of someone paying attention at the right moment. She thought she believed that too. The light was going in the west, the sky above the bare oaks turning from orange to deep blue. Inside the funhouse, through the windows, she could see the mirrors catching the light and passing it around the room. The fortune teller's cabinet was in the corner now, moved from the center. The compartment beneath it sealed, and the panel fitted back into place, but not locked, because there was nothing left inside to protect, and the mechanism was worth preserving as itself, a record of what the building had known how to hold. Clara came running back across the grass and grabbed Rosalie's hand and said something urgent about a beetle, and Rosalie crouched down to be at her height and listened to the beetle report with complete seriousness. Delia watched them. She was not prone to sentiment, and she did not let herself become prone to it now, but she allowed herself to recognize what she was looking at, which was the end of a long interruption. A family reconnecting to a place it had been separated from, a property reconnecting to the people it had been kept from, a building doing what it had been built to do. She thought about Harlan's words, the surprise of yourself, the discovery that the world is larger on the inside than it looks from outside. She thought that was probably the best description of a funhouse that she had ever heard, and also a reasonable description of what the past 6 months had been. Third building was finished in early summer. A woman named Petra, a different Petra, not the attorney, a 19-year-old from Dayton who went by Pete and who had been referred by the Columbus nonprofit, moved into the last unit and immediately repainted the door a specific shade of yellow she had apparently wanted for a long time, and Delia, passing by the next morning, looked at the yellow door and thought it was a very good color for a door. She enrolled in the contractor's licensing program at the community college in Hargrove in September. Met 2 evenings a week and required passing 4 examinations over 9 months. She had not been in a formal classroom since she was 16. She sat in the back row the first evening and looked at the other students, most of them older, some of them significantly older, career changers and builders who had been doing the work for years and needed the credential, and felt, not for the first time, and probably not for the last, the particular sensation of being in a room where she did not obviously belong and staying anyway. She was good at the coursework, better than she expected, which told her that Dale had given her more than she had realized, that the years of following him through buildings and listening to what he said about them had gone somewhere she could now access. The examination on structural assessment she passed with the highest score in her cohort. Her instructor, a man named Wick, who had been building in Ohio for 30 years, looked at her exam and then looked at her and said, "Who taught you?" "A man named Dale," Delia said. "He was an electrician." Wick nodded. "Good teacher. The best," Delia said. November, exactly 1 year after she had worked the bolt on the service door of the Funhouse and stepped into the smell of old wood and machine oil, and that sweet undercurrent she had never quite named, Delia sat in the main floor of the building on the restored tongue and groove floor and read. It was evening. The residents were in their units or in the common room of the second housing structure, where someone had acquired a second-hand television, and there was apparently a competitive argument underway about what to watch. She could hear it faintly through the building, voices rising and falling, the particular sound of a group of people who had been strangers 4 months ago and were now familiar enough to disagree. She had a textbook in her lap, open to the chapter on commercial building codes, which she needed to know for the third examination. The fortune teller's cabinet was visible across the room, its cracked painted face catching the light from the standing lamp she'd brought in. She looked at the cabinet for a moment. Then she looked at the hall of mirrors along the far wall, the panels cleaned and reinstalled. She could see herself in them from where she sat. A young woman on a wooden floor with a textbook, multiplied and fragmented and reassembled across a dozen angled surfaces. 18 years old in the panels, 19 in the body sitting there, and some age she didn't have a word for in the expression she wore, which was not the careful, composed expression of the girl who had arrived at a bus stop in Carlow with $47 and a photograph of a woman she barely remembered. She was not the heir. She had never been the heir. What she had been was the person who was there, who had paid attention, who had stayed with the problem until it revealed itself. She thought about what that had produced. 6 people in units with keys that were theirs. A building restored to what it had been built to be. A family connected to a place it had been separated from. A legal process concluded that had been obstructed for 5 years. Deed in the official record instead of a cedar-lined compartment in the dark. She thought about all the things that had needed to go a specific way for any of it to happen. The bus ticket, broken bolt, the loose fence post, the night she had needed somewhere to be for 3 hours. She did not believe those things had been arranged. She believed they had simply been there, and that she had been someone who noticed them, and that noticing and acting on what you notice was the closest thing to agency that the world reliably offered. That felt like enough. Outside the Funhouse, the Carnival grounds were quiet. In the November dark, the light poles throwing their yellow circles on the frost, the oaks bare overhead, the road at the edge of the property carrying the occasional sound of a car going by, someone moving through Carlow toward somewhere else. She turned a page in the textbook and kept reading. The contractor's license arrived in the mail in late spring. A card in an envelope that was slightly too small for it, the edges bent. Straightened it carefully and put it on the shelf in her unit, in the Funhouse, in the room that was hers. Next to Dale's tools in the canvas roll he had kept them in, and which she had carried in her backpack for 3 years. She looked at both objects on the shelf for a moment. Then she put on her boots and went to work. Rosalie called that afternoon from Columbus to say that the first royalty payment had been received, that the mineral extraction was proceeding on schedule, and that Petra the attorney was pleased with the structure of the agreement. She said it with the same steadiness she said most things, The quality that Delia had come to understand was not indifference, but its opposite. The composures of someone who has felt things very fully and decided that feeling them fully didn't require displaying them at all times. She also said, "I'm bringing Clara down this weekend. She's been asking about the Mirror House for 2 weeks. Tell her the mirrors are very happy to see her," Delia said. "I'll tell her that." There was a brief pause. "How are you?" "Busy." She paused. "I passed my licensing exam, I know. Bette told me." Rosalie's voice carried something warm. "She said you got the highest score in your cohort." "Bette doesn't need to tell people everything she knows." She disagreed. Rosalie paused. "Delia, yes, thank you. I know I've said it. I'll probably keep saying it because I don't think I'll ever entirely stop meaning it. You could have found that box and walked away, and no one would ever have known the difference." "I would have," Delia said. "I know. That's the point." Taunable. After they hung up, Delia stood for a moment in the main floor of the funhouse, in the afternoon light that came through the windows and moved across the mirrors. She looked at the fortune teller in the corner, the cracked paint face and the hands extended over the crystal ball, the one visible eye catching the light the same way that it had caught her flashlight beam on the first night, nearly 18 months ago now. She had thought about what Harlan had meant by it, the choice of this specific cabinet, at the center of the specific room he had built his whole funhouse around. A fortune teller was a thing that promised revelation, promised that what was hidden could be known, that what was coming could be seen, that the world beyond the present moment was not entirely opaque. Carnivals had always traded on that promise, on the human need to believe that the future was legible if you knew how to read it. What Harlan had done was put the most important thing he possessed inside that promise, not revealed by it, not dependent on it, but nested within it, inside the mechanism of the fortune teller, behind the illusion of foresight, in the cedar-lined dark where the real thing lived. She thought that was the most honest thing she had ever encountered in a building. The acknowledgement that what mattered was not the performance of knowing what was coming, but the patient, careful work of protecting what was real until the right moment arrived for it. She was 19 years old with a contractor's license and a room of her own and a crew she trusted and a shelf with Dale's tools on it. The photograph of the woman she barely remembered was on the same shelf. The woman laughing at something off to the left, her head tilted back, her dark curly hair lifting in invisible wind. She did not know what was coming. She did not need to. She picked up her tool bag and went out into the spring morning to go to work, and the door swung closed behind her, and the mirrors caught the light and passed it around the empty room, and the funhouse settled into its own quiet, solid on its good bones, full of what it had always been built to hold. The summer she turned 20, Delia took on her first job outside Carlow. Was a referral from Wick, her instructor from the licensing program, who had a client in Hargrove, a woman named Gloria Marsh, no relation, who owned a 3-unit rental building that needed its entire second floor reframed after a slow roof leak, had gone undetected for 4 years, and done the kind of patient structural damage that only reveals itself fully once you start pulling ceilings. Wick said he could give her the job himself, but he was overcommitted through August, and he said it in the particular way of someone who is extending a professional courtesy while presenting it as simple logistics. Delia drove to Hargrove to walk the building on a Wednesday morning. She went through it the way Dale had taught her, slowly, floor first, then walls, then ceiling, then the roof deck above. She found the damage and assessed it and wrote the scope on a yellow legal pad and called Gloria Marsh that afternoon with a number. Gloria Marsh said, "That's less than the last person quoted me." "I know what the work costs," Delia said. She hired 2 people from Carlow for the Hargrove job, including Simone, who had been doing drywall with her since the Funhouse, and who was, Delia had concluded, one of the most technically precise finishers she had ever watched work. Drove to Hargrove 3 days a week for 6 weeks and did the job. And when they were done, Gloria Marsh walked the second floor and said nothing for a long time, and then said, "The floor doesn't move." Delia said it shouldn't. "I sistered the joists in 4 places and replaced the subfloor in the 2 bays where the saturation was worst." "Won't move," Gloria Marsh looked at her. "How old are you?" 20. "Who taught you?" "A man named Dale," Delia said. Was becoming a kind of refrain. The answer she gave every time someone asked that question, which was often enough to tell her that what Dale had given her was visible to people who knew how to look. The same way good framing was visible to someone who knew how to read a building. "He taught you well," Gloria Marsh said. "He did," Delia said. On the drive back to Carlow that evening, Simone said from the passenger seat, "You're going to run out of work in Carlow." "I know," Delia said. "Is that a problem?" She thought about it. The housing program had its maintenance needs, which would be ongoing, and Bette had work at the shop that kept her occupied 2 days a week, and there was always something in the town that needed a person who knew buildings. But Simone was right that the specific scale of work she was capable of had moved past what Carlow's 6,000 people could sustain indefinitely. "No," she said, "it's not a problem. What's the plan?" Delia watched the highway, the flat farmland going blue in the early evening. She had been thinking about it since the Hargrove job, since the moment she had stood in Gloria Marsh's second floor and felt the floor steady under her feet because she had made it steady. She had been thinking about what it would mean to do that work more broadly, not just in one town, not just for one woman who had let her sleep on a pullout, but for the kind of buildings that needed it, and the kind of people who owned them and couldn't always afford the rate that a larger firm would charge. "I want to keep the work small," she said. "Not a big operation. Crew that moves between jobs, that does the work right, and charges what it actually costs and doesn't pad the scope. That's not how most contractors make money." "I know." She paused. Dale made a living at it. Simone was quiet for a moment. She had heard about Dale in the way everyone who worked with Delia heard about Dale, gradually, in pieces, referenced the way you reference someone whose influence is so structural it's easier to point at what they built than to describe the builder. She did not ask further. She looked out the window at the passing farmland and said, "I'm in if you'll have me." Delia said, "I was counting on it." They drove the rest of the way in comfortable quiet, the kind that develops between people who have spent 6 weeks doing close, careful work in the same space and no longer need to fill the silence with anything other than themselves. The photograph of the woman who might have been her mother sat on the shelf in Delia's unit when she got home. The woman laughing at something off to the left, the dark curly hair lifting. Delia set her tool bag on the floor and looked at it for a moment. She had carried it for 3 years without knowing exactly why. Not comfort, she had told herself. Evidence, proof of origin. But she understood now, in the way you understand things that have been true for a long time before you find the words for them, that what the photograph had actually been was a kind of compass, not pointing toward the woman in it, who was gone and unreachable, and had been gone since before Delia was old enough to form a continuous memory, pointing toward the fact that she had come from somewhere, from someone, and that this was not nothing, even when it felt like nothing, even when the bus ticket and the garbage bag and the indifferent machinery of the system made it feel like she had arrived in the world without origin or claim. She put the photograph back on the shelf beside Dale's tools and went to wash her hands. Outside, the carnival grounds were quiet. In the summer evening, the light warm on the funhouse walls, the chevrons faded but the structure solid. Someone had planted something along the path between the funhouse and the housing buildings, small and green and not yet identifiable, something that would need a season to become itself. She didn't know who had planted it. It didn't matter. Someone had looked at a patch of ground and decided it should have something growing in it, and had done the work of planting. And whatever came up in the spring would be the answer to that decision. That was enough. She had come to believe what most good things were made of. Not fortune or inheritance, or the specific arrangement of chance that had brought her to a broken bolt on a cold night in November. Those were the occasions. What the occasions opened onto was just this: the decision to stay, to pay attention, to do the work in front of you until it was done, and then to find the next thing that needed doing and begin again. She picked up her tool bag and carried it inside, and the evening settled over Carlow, and the funhouse held its quiet, and the mirrors inside it went on doing what mirrors do, taking in whatever light was available and giving it back, changed, multiplied, returned to the room as something larger than what had entered. Stories like this remind us that starting over is terrifying, but it is always possible. If you or someone you love is facing a total reset right now, whether from a divorce, a loss, or a financial disaster, you need a plan. Scan the QR code on your screen or click the link below to get the Phoenix Blueprint for just $17. It gives you the exact steps you need to take in the first 48 hours and a 90-day plan to get your independence back. Thank you for watching.